The maw's offering. The crowd pressed together, a writhing mass of desperate flesh drenched in the mingling scents of sweat and misery. It was the first day of the month, drop day, and that meant fresh meat. The noise swelled, a chaotic blend of shouts, curses, and anticipation, as figures moved atop the maw, the only opening to Rendhold Underprison. Guards and goods began to line the edges, their presence igniting a frenzy among the inmates below. Dantes stood at the outskirts, arms crossed, watching. He had learned the hard way how dangerous it was to be too close to the drop. His fingers drifted to the scar between his ribs, a permanent reminder of when he'd been stabbed over a sack of potatoes. He had hoped to sit this month out, to live off his own supplies. But after losing days' worth of rations on a bad roll of dice, he was short on luck, and even shorter on food. There were other ways to survive. He could take odd jobs from the gangs, steal, or even scavenge the outer pits for mushrooms or rats. He planned to do all three. But first, he'd see if he could work the drop in his favor. A magically amplified voice rang out from above. Clear the maw. The sunlight streaming through the opening became a curse rather than a blessing. The inmates beneath it scattered, pushing back into the shadows at the edges of the pit. Some remained. They always did. A pair of bare feet, a few scraps of food, or even a warm body for the long nights were worth the risk. Dantes watched as the first bags came down. Heavy sacks of provisions, 40 to 50 pounds each, slammed into the earth, kicking up plumes of dust. The prisoners in the center scrambled, tearing them open with shivs, claws, teeth, and tusks. A human, midway through ripping open a sack of turnips, was flattened as another sack landed directly on his spine. A brief moment of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Then the laughter came. The guards above howled. The prisoners below chuckled, some out of cruelty, others out of relief that it wasn't them. Dantes ignored it. The guard had played this game for over a century, trying to crush inmates for sport. The unlucky ones were left to rot in the dirt. The lucky ones? They crawled away with broken bones, assuming no one was desperate enough to finish them off. Fresh meat. As the guards continued to hurl supplies, they began lining up the new prisoners at the maw's edge. They stood there, clutching their ragged clothes, wide-eyed and trembling. Dantes remembered standing there himself 5 years ago. The fear, the rage, the desperation, tracking every bag of food, calculating where he would land, who he would have to fight, what he would have to do to survive. The chanting of a mage drifted through the air, featherfall, a cruel parody of mercy. Then came the sound of a boot against the back. The first prisoner, a half-elf, screamed as he fell, clawing at the edge before a guard lobbed a rock at his fingers. His descent ended with an orc's hand around his ankle. Dantes didn't even flinch as the orc slammed him into the ground, stripping him of his boots, his pockets, his dignity before moving to the next victim. If he was lucky, he'd be left alive. If not, well. The next prisoner in line panicked. Before the mage could enchant him, he jumped, head first. His neck snapped on impact. A brief applause erupted, a rare moment of solidarity between guards and inmates alike. Dantes nodded to himself. That was a clean one. Most suicides were messy, eh? After that, the smarter prisoners took their landings in stride. Some fought back, some scrambled for supplies, and some ran for the shadows before anyone could get to them. Those who had already secured sacks of food also began moving, sticking to groups. There was safety in numbers. Because at the edge of the maw's light, the gangs were waiting. Dantes watched as a dwarf tried to push through the elfin kings. Big mistake. The elves swarmed him, knives flashing. Dantes couldn't see the full extent of the violence, but by the time they were done, the dwarf was either dead or wishing he was. A different elf, one covered in tree and vine tattoos, walked up to the gang. They welcomed him. Dantes recognized the gesture. Someone from above, now below. He made a mental note to avoid him. His attention shifted to the orc who had beaten the half-elf earlier. A group of dwarves from Clan Stonedust caught him off guard and took him down at the legs. No honor among thieves. And then Dantes saw him. A human, not fresh meat, but a veteran. No gang tattoos, no allegiance, just two heavy sacks over his shoulder. Dantes watched closely as the man timed his escape, waiting for a gap between the Elfland kings and the collard. The moment it opened, he ran. He vaulted over a halfling, bashed a shiv-wielding inmate aside with a sack, and slipped through just as the two gangs clashed. A lucky distraction that let him break free. Dantes smirked. Smart bastard. Then he moved. The man had made a clean getaway, but Dantes had been watching. He saw him toss a sack into the air behind him, sending inmates diving for it. Dantes had noticed something else. That sack had been full of rocks. By the time the inmates realized it, the man was gone. And by the time he entered the tunnel, Dantes was waiting. The rock in his hand cracked against the back of the man's skull. He dropped unconscious. Dantes grabbed the real sack, slung it over his shoulder, and ran deeper into the tunnels, whispering a silent prayer to the god of thieves as he vanished into the depths of Rendhold Underprison. Sanctuary in the shadows. Dantes took the long way home, weaving through narrow tunnels, slipping past the undermarket, exchanging nods with the collard, and finally moving into the deepest sections, where only kobolds, rats, and himself dared to live. He squeezed through a crack in the rock, dragging his haul behind him. A brown rat squeaked from the shadows. Dantes ripped a piece of dried meat from his stash and tossed it into the corner. "You're welcome." The rat ate in silence. Dantes sat down, surveying his loot: potatoes, dried meat, hardtack, cotton bolts, and even fruit. Enough to last the month. He should have been satisfied. But as he stared at the meager scraps, bitterness curled in his gut. Once, he had counted coins and jewels. Now, he was grateful for hardtack. He clenched his jaw, the memories flashing, the betrayal, the fall, the guard's boots against his ribs. Another squeak. He sighed, tossing another piece of meat into the corner. "Don't get used to it." The rat ate in silence. Dantes chuckled darkly. Good point. No reason to dwell. Survival was all that mattered. A gamble in the undermarket. Dantes sliced a potato in half using a sharp rock jutting from the corner of his dwelling. He took a few strips of dried meat, a bit of hardtack, and a handful of grapes, setting them aside for his meal. He poured a trickle of water over the hardtack to soften it, chewing methodically as he listened to the quiet gnawing of the rat in the corner. They ate in silence, separate, but in an odd way, companions. When he was done, he rose, walked to the drip of fresh water from the ceiling, and rinsed the blood from his hands. The cool water stung against his knuckles, but he ignored it. He dried them off on his worn jacket, replaced his water pitcher, and stored the remaining food in a hidden alcove, sealing it with a heavy stone. No one knew where he slept. No one knew where he kept his food, and that was why he was still alive. Even the rat, despite its meal, would take more if given the chance. Dantes couldn't blame it. He'd do the same in its position. Now, with his meal finished and supplies secured, he had one thing in excess: time. Choices in the pit. The same three choices presented themselves. Visit the market. With the drop complete, the undermarket would be full of new goods, and more importantly, new fools looking to trade them away for booze, weed, or companionship. Shoot dice. A tempting thought, but gambling had already forced him to risk the maw today. He wasn't about to test both the god of thieves and the god of fortune on the same day. Find work with the collard. The weakest gang in the pit by far, but the only one he had decent relations with. The market was the best option, but he needed something to trade. Stealing was always an option, but he had learned the hard way. Picking pockets in the pit was a hell of a lot harder than doing it on the streets of Rendhold. Here, everyone was paranoid, and no one trusted anyone, especially after a drop-day binge. Instead, he had a different plan. Dantes moved to the far corner of his cave. There, next to an old scavenge bucket, was his experiment, a poisonous investment. Few plants could survive in the pit. Fungus, however, was another matter. For the past few months, he had been growing mushrooms, hoping to find a variety he could eat to supplement his meals. It had been a failure. The fat blue mushrooms he had cultivated turned out to be poisonous. He'd tested them, slipping a few into a communal stew and watching the results. Humans and elves? Violent illness. Orcs, kobolds, and dwarves? completely unaffected. His own mixed blood made him tougher than most, but he wasn't stupid enough to risk it. Still, there were plenty of prisoners who had use for poison, whether for killing, spiking drinks, or more creative purposes. Dantes plucked a handful of the mushrooms, wrapped them in a loose cloth pouch, and tucked it into one of the many pockets of his jacket. He slid a shiv into his sleeve, took a sip of stale water, relieved himself in the bucket, and slipped through the crack in the wall into the tunnels. Through the collard's territory, he moved silently, pausing just long enough to let his eyes adjust to the ever-present gloom of the underprison. Only a few roaches skittered along the walls. No watchful eyes, no hidden threats. Satisfied, he moved toward the market. The trip was smooth until he reached collard territory. A few nods were exchanged as he passed. They recognized him. The collard were a gang made up of former mages, men and women who had been thrown into the pit for crimes against the council. Some had used magic for theft, others for murder, and at least one, Old Merle, had allegedly turned a councilman into a chicken, beheaded him, and ate him for dinner. If they still had magic, they would have ruled the pit. But they didn't. Each of them wore a bronze collar, enchanted to seal away their power. There had been attempts to break them, many attempts, but the collars were both physically and magically sealed. A mage was needed to break the collar, but to free a mage, the collar had to be broken first. It was a flawless trap, a favor for Televor. As Dantes neared the exit of the collard's territory, a voice called after him. "Dantes, wait up," he sighed. The speaker was Televor, a half-elf in tattered magus robes, a bronze collar wrapped tightly around his throat. Dantes kept walking. "What is it, Tel? Need another loan?" No. Televor chuckled nervously. "My ribs are still bruised from when I forgot to pay you last time." Dantes nodded. "Sorry about that. Can't let anyone slide. It puts a target on my back. Nothing personal." Yeah, I get it. Rules are rules." Dantes doubted that. But Tel was learning, at least. "All right then, what do you want?" Televor hesitated. "You're headed to the market, right?" Dantes raised an eyebrow. "And I heard from Micah that the changelings there, Dantes snorted. "You want to get your rocks off, huh?" I don't care, Tel. No judgment from me. People don't have many options down here." Televor scratched at his collar, clearly embarrassed. "Well, I also heard you get along with the changelings. I was hoping maybe you could talk them into giving me a better rate." Dantes walked in silence, letting Tel simmer in his own awkwardness. The changelings liked him, true. He could probably get Tel a discount. But what did he get out of it? Televor was broke, and whatever he had left, he was about to spend on 3 minutes of pleasure. Dantes finally spoke. "I'll put in a word, but you'll owe me a favor." Tel stopped walking. His face twisted as he processed the offer. Open-ended favors were dangerous. Dantes had already collected from him before. Tel knew that Dantes would make good on his debt. But he wasn't thinking with the right head. "Deal. I'll owe you one." Dantes nodded and held out a hand. Tel hesitated, then shook it, one firm grasp before letting go. Dantes held back a sigh. Despite all evidence to the contrary, he actually liked Televor. Most collards struggled in the pit. Too arrogant, too entitled, too weak to survive. Tel, at least, was trying. Sure, most of what he did was stupid, but stupidity was still better than inaction. They wove through the final tunnels, stepping widely around a dark passage marked with an X and an I. Some tunnels weren't worth crossing. As they neared the undermarket, the stench of booze and murmur of trade filled the air. Dantes smirked. "Time to see what the market had."
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
On either side of the entrance to the market stood dwarven guards, members of the Smallfolk Consortium, known by anyone outside it as the Smallfolk Consortium. They ran the undermarket, and the gang was made up of halflings, gnomes, and a smattering of kobolds and dwarves that had either joined willingly for the perks or been hired on as muscle. Initially, he expected the smaller races to be at a distinct disadvantage in the underprison, but there were a lot of benefits to being small in a series of enclosed spaces. There were entire sections of the prison only they could access, perfect for storing goods, or even finding what little scavenging could be had in the old tunnels. The guards ignored them as they came through. They'd both been there before, and while they may try to extort some kind of entrance fee from Tell had he been alone, they sensed that it wouldn't be worth the trouble with Dantes. The odd pair walked to the edge of the market proper. The market had been built in the highest and widest part of the pit aside from the maw itself. The buildings and booths were assembled from scraps of wood, cloth, and whatever else prisoners could scrape together. Those merchants that couldn't afford to build a storefront would lay down cloth and scatter their goods on it, or even just sell it from their person. Dantes took a deep breath and soaked it all in. The undermarket was the closest thing to his home on the surface that Head had, a den of vice and sin full of possibility. His home, that is, the undermarket itself's possibilities were thoroughly limited by the fact that it was inside of an understocked underground prison. Dantes ignored a man selling crude shivs and another that was dealing dust, though he felt the same pang he always did when he received the offer. Too expensive a habit to maintain in the pit, though. Back up top, Head do a line or two to pass the time or to add to his excitement for the next job. Head spent a hard few weeks quitting when Head first arrived. The risk that surrounded it was much higher in the pit. Tell paused to gaze longingly at the bar in which a fight had just broken out. The powerful smell of hooch radiating from it, with enough stench to burn the hairs out of his nostrils. "Did you want booze or company?" Dantes asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I don't think you need my help with the booze, and I'm here for a reason." Tell shook his head. "Sorry, I forgot how much I missed a strong drink at the tavern. I never considered it would be something I'd lack easy access to. Booze is easier to come by than a lot of ices down here, at least. I know a kobold with a hidden still that has good rates. He'll introduce you." "Thanks, Dantes." "No problem." He had told Mez Head send anyone interested in a strong drink his way, and in return Head receive a bit of the brew or what they traded. He neglected to mention his near certainty that what Mez brewed could cause blindness in large doses. They walked through a few more ramshackle alleys to one of the largest buildings in the pit, which went the Changeling Brothel. It was basically a long hallway with rooms separated by thin curtains of cloth, with a few having actual rooms toward the back. At the front was a large orc with a crude club and a human with a series of shivs belted at his waist. Their eyes were both completely white, with no pupils showing. They were nameless. Dantes didn't know if they were men who had simply been too desperate on a lonely night, or had made a bad gamble, but there were many such under the Changelings' control. The Changelings couldn't defend themselves. The agreement they made at their sentencing meant they had to follow rules in the pit that kept them from hurting others or using their abilities to escape. Otherwise, they'd be impossible to keep in the pit. Luckily, they were too fey-blooded to break the agreement, though they'd found clever ways around it where they could. Between them was a perky young half-elf girl wearing a short skirt and tight shirt. Then she was a well-endowed and muscled Orcish woman with bedroom eyes. Then she was a human woman wearing the clothing of nobility and a haughty expression. The men who walked by, even on their way to do other business, couldn't help but look, and no seller bothered trying to hawk their wares there, as no one would have bothered turning their gaze in the direction of their goods. The now gnome woman, who almost certainly wouldn't be able to see her own feet, waved at them. "To name, no name, welcome." "Hello, Sin. Calling me Dantes is fine. I've told you as much before." She became a tall, elven woman in a sheer robe. "How did you know it was me?" Dantes shrugged. "Not sure, just a feeling." That was true, but his feelings were always right when it came to which changeling was which. A case of theft. This story is not rightfully on Amazon. If you spot it, report the violation. Sin smiled, playing with her eye color. "Are you here to gamble, or are you finally lonely enough to pass the time with us some other way?" "Neither. Just walking a friend over here to meet you." Sin turned her attention to Televor. "Can I have your name?" she asked, as she sauntered over to him and gently stroked down his arm with a single finger. He shivered at her touch. "I'm Dash." Dantes shot him a glare. Head thought he was smarter than that. He saw the expression and caught himself. "You can't have my name, but you can call me Tell." "Ah, a shame. You brought us one who isn't a fool this time." "I wouldn't say that. He seems to have his moments." Sin chuckled. "I'm always in a playful mood when you come to visit Tuname." How about I give your friend a discount? That's up to him, said Dantes, pretending that wasn't exactly what he was there for. Why, yes, please. I do like that very much. Sin looked Tell over, her eyes turning violet, then blue, while her teeth switched between fanged and tusked. A nervous boy. Yeah, he'll prepare something special for you. It'll be in the last room on the left. Give me just a moment. They watch her walk away, Dantes getting a little flicker of what she actually looked like. Pure white skin, 2 long limbs ending in clawed hands, and black hair down the back. He was grateful he hadn't seen her pure black eyes at least. Those flickers had happened randomly since the first time he'd seen one of them. They made it quite a bit easier for him to resist their temptations. Though after 5 years without a woman's touch, it still hadn't been easy. Why do they call you two name, no name? At it novel been at it. My mother named me one thing, and my father another. I have 2 names, but no true name. Means they can't own me. Also means I can gamble with them safely, which they appreciate. Apparently it gets tiresome when the stakes are always someone's firstborn, their name, or other face shit like that. Interesting. My studies were always into demons rather than the fae. That explains your penchant for alcohol and whoring. Also why you almost let yourself become an eternal slave at the touch of a woman. Tell blushed a bit. The other collared aren't exactly pretty to look at. ID never met changelings before. I had expected it to be more obvious that they weren't what they were pretending to be. It took me off guard. How would you know you've never met one before? Fair point. It's not like they're men dressed as women. They're neither. That's why the city just sends half here and half to the convent. Tell went to respond, but a high female voice with a slight lilt drifted from the furthest room of the brothel. Teal, come in. Tell coughed and ran a hand through his mop of hair. How do I look? Dantes sighed. Since a whore Tell, it doesn't matter how you look. Oh, right. Wish me luck. Absolutely not. Oh well. Meet here later for the trek back? Sure. Though Dantes expected him to be waiting for him for quite some time after he was done. Tell nodded and headed for the far room. Dantes saw a slender woman's hand reach out and drag him inside. Dantes shook his head and started walking through the market. Had done well on securing food for the month, but food wasn't everything. Dantes looked through the goods of a gnome selling the clothes of dead men. Another who was selling a nice collection of clubs fashioned with stone at the ends for a bit of additional oomph. One selling hand-woven lengths of rope. And finally, he came to a dwarven booth that smelled of vegetation, which he found himself drawn to. The dwarf was wearing a dirt-brown tunic, though it may have been white once. He had mushrooms growing from parts of his dark black beard, and a thin pipe from which the scent of dwarven weed wafted. He was engaged with a different customer when Dantes approached the booth, but gave him a nod. The gesture was to both acknowledge his presence and let him know that he was watching him if anything went missing. The wares he was selling were primarily plants. He had crude pots filled with dirt on each available surface, and from each of them grew stems, vines, shrubs, and all manner of other items. Dantes had thought himself lucky for the few patches of moss he was able to keep alive in his cave, but this dwarf had managed far more, and somehow Dantes had never even noticed him before. He took a deep inhale of the leaves of one of the plants, the scent of green and earth filling his nostrils. For a moment he was in the gardens in the center of the city, and walking the overgrown alleys that had been near his childhood home. And climbing the vines he used to scale up to rooftops in the most dilapidated districts looking for food or to escape some moron head pickpocket. He allowed a long sigh. Smelling is free, but if you want something to smoke, we'll have to deal. Dantes pulled himself away from the fresh green scent and looked down at the dwarf, ignoring his comment in favor of asking question. How did you grow all this down here? The dwarf's eyes narrowed. You trying to steal my secrets? No, I'm asking for them directly. The merchant chuckled, taking a pull from his pipe and letting some smoke seep slowly out of his mouth. Much like you wouldn't know, but the pit is a big place. Us dwarves have managed, over the centuries, to carve new chambers or excavate old ones. Though it's been hellish work without proper tools, and with the strange thickness of the walls and a magic shield that seals us in, otherwise wed just tunneled out of course. There are some chambers where the walls are like reflective glass, and in a few of those there is light, like sunlight, that bleeds through them. What about the seeds? Those came in with the other supplies that they dropped in. Collect them over time and cultivate what I can from what I grow. Even the weed? He shook his head. Well, that came in the dwarven way. Just like the elfling king and consortium get things in their way. That's obviously not something I can share. Dantes nodded, pretending to respect the secret. He already knew that the elves brought their goods in with some type of magical mirror shards. The human gangs tended to have people toss goods into the maw at specific times. The consortium bribed the guards to bring in goods during their arena recruitments and prisoner withdrawals. He was certain that there were other methods going on, but those were the ones Head managed to determine since Head arrived. No one knew that he knew that, and he did his best to keep it that way. Anyway, I assume you're buying something? If I spent this much time talking to you, and if you're not, well, it'll probably have to stab you or give you a beating. Dantes nodded. Understandable. I'm interested in trading. He pulled out his separate sack of mushrooms and pulled a single one of them, which he held out to the dwarf, focusing on his bearded face as he did so to gauge any reactions. He saw the dwarf's nostrils widen for just a moment, but no other facial twitches. Dwarves were either stone-faced or as easy to read as a child. Dantes had never known one to be in between. The dwarf reached out for the mushrooms slowly, but Dantes pulled back before he could reach it. Interested? The dwarf wiggled his jaw, the mushrooms within his beard shifting side to side as he did so. I suppose I am. How much have you got? He held the sack open so that the dwarf could see the dozen or so mushrooms inside. The dwarf stroked his beard. I could do you a bit of weed for that. A bit of weed for each one, I assume? The dwarf shook his head. You're cheeky, I appreciate that. How about a half pouch, and you owe me one? How about a full pouch, and the next time I harvest them, I remember how generous you were. The dwarf's eyebrow flicked up. You grew these? Didn't just find them? Dantes hesitated, but nodded. Interesting you've got a deal. The dwarf spat on his hand and held it out. Dantes matched the gesture and had a firm shake before exchanging the goods. In clay, by the way. Dantes. They exchanged a nod, and Dantes walked away, tucking the weed into a small compartment Head made in his coat. He hadn't been looking specifically for the weed when Head come to the market, but it was a good choice to trade for. Unlike the mushrooms, which had limited utility for most, the weed could be traded to anyone for anything and would keep for a much longer time. Not to mention that he could put some to the side for his own personal recreation. He could have gone with coin, of course, but only the consortium dealt with straight coin. Bartering tended to be more economical in most cases. He considered doing some more trading, but figured that tell had likely been done for quite some time. Dantes imagined that any man may not have a lot of stamina after a year without any of that kind of attention. He made his way through the narrow alleys between buildings, ignoring pleas from desperate sellers who didn't seem to be earning what they needed to cover the consortium's fees for the day. The nearest bar to the Witch Wench was full of elves, so he drew his hood close over his head as he passed by. On the surface, and in the pit, there were a number of advantages to being a mutt. It usually had the benefit of making him easy to ignore and hard to distinguish. He could sometimes pass for human or orc in the right light, but elf was never going to happen. He was too short, his skin too gray, and while his ears were pointed, they were hardly going to disguise anything else about him. But if one of the elven kings with a belly full of drink and a desire to blow off steam saw him, he knew He'd be the first target they would choose. They could stand mixing of the races, but only as long as elves weren't part of that mix. The narrative has been taken without permission. Report any sightings. Dantes was so distracted by trying to appear inconspicuous, he didn't notice the three men standing between him and the brothel. When he did, he tried to adjust the direction he was walking, and the men fanned out to block him. He looked at them more closely, sensing Head just walked into trouble. All three were human, wearing ragged clothes and wielding either clubs or shivs. One of them smelled of dry blood and looked vaguely familiar. The bloody one took a step toward him, and he took a step back, looking for a way out only to find the path behind him blocked by a fourth man. I figured you'd come here. Thought you could steal my hard work and hawk it in the undermarket before we found you, huh? Dantes finally recognized the man. He was the one who had stolen from earlier that day. Head thought Head killed him, or at least remained unseen when he struck, but either had gotten a good look or one of his friends had. I don't know what you're talking about. I've never seen you before. The men started close in. Dantes wasn't much good in a straight-up fight. Head been the planner, face, and occasionally the quick hands of his gang, but never the muscle. Dantes' face became nervous, and he fell as he backed away. Please, please, I'm just trying to do what I can to survive down here. Same as you. You know, it's dog-eat-dog down here. One of the men got closer and raised his foot. Shut up, you filthy mutt. He kicked at his head. Dantes' hand shot up. He grabbed the man's foot and dragged the blade of the shiv Head taken from his boot when Head pretended to fall across the man's heel and tendons. The man screamed as he fell back, clutching his leg. Dantes grabbed a handful of dirt and chucked it into the next nearest man's eyes, blinding him as he stood. Then he tried to make a break for it. Unfortunately, he hadn't noticed the fifth man, who caught him by the hood and threw him back between the three who were left standing. Dantes threw himself back to his feet, brandishing his shiv, his eyes looking for some way out even as the three men closed in, ignoring their fellow as he rolled on the ground, howling in pain and clutching his leg. At this point, the elves from the bar had noticed the scrap and brought their booze over to take a closer look. I think the humans will probably take the mutt, said one of them. I don't know. The points on the mutt's ears of fourth and elf can probably take 4 humans. Or at least get away. A third elf, one covered in tattoos of trees and roots, the same one Dantes had seen arrive in the pit earlier, smashed his fists into the second one's gut, causing him to double over and spill his drink. The blood that's muddied only grows exponentially weaker, you fucking moron. The mutt will die. Worth watching it happen, I'd say. Dantes wasn't paying attention to the elves. He lunged toward the nearest of the men, managing to jam his shiv into his gut. But when he tried to pull it away, it got caught on a rib, and he couldn't remove it. The bloody man grabbed him and threw him to the ground. He and the 2 uninjured men began savagely kicking him while he was down. Dantes curled into a ball, focusing on protecting his head. His reflexes kicked in from when he was a child picking pockets. Wait, yelled Dantes. I still haven't sold what I took from you. I have it hidden, but I won't be able to give it to you if I'm dead. The men stopped and hesitated for a moment. At that second, Dantes pulled a second shiv from his sleeve and threw himself forward at the bloody man, jamming the crude stone blade into his eye. They fell and crashed into the tattooed elf, knocking him backward and spilling his drink. Dantes stood up, disoriented from the beating head just taken, and tore his shiv from the man's face, stumbling into the elf once again. He threw him off of him, and Dantes' arm jerked up and sliced across the elf's face. Dantes stood there, his eyes widening as he realized what had just done, seeing the blood begin to flow from the wound on the elf's face. The elf's solid green eyes looked at him with hate, and he brought a hand to his face, wiping away the trickle of blood. His mouth was twisted into a sneer as he looked at the men around him. Grab that fucking mutt. I'm going to gut him. Dantes bolted, one of the elves narrowly missing a lunge for him. He made his way toward the furthest exit tunnel from the undermarket, dodging through the people buying and selling, leaping over blankets scattered with goods, and ducking through narrow alleys. He could hear the elves starting to pursue him as he wove through the market at Novel Benedat. One elf jumped in front of him, but he slammed the shiv still in his hand into the man's shoulder, leaving it there as he kept running. 2 more of them moved to cut him off, but he slid through the legs of one of them, tripping him as he threw himself back to his feet and kept running. He made it to the exit and moved into the tunnels. Had chosen the far exit not only for the increased number of obstacles it would create between him and his pursuers, but also because it linked up to the clan Stonedust territory. His movement through that territory stirred the dwarves there up just in time for them to meet the elves. He heard the mixture of elvish screaming and dwarven curses collide, even as he wove deeper into the tunnels. He didn't slow down until he was near the kobold tunnels, and even then he kept changing paths and doubling back. He even left a few false trails leading into forbidden tunnels in the hopes they might find them and think Head run to his death in desperation to escape. By the time he made it back to his cave, he was drenched in sweat and gasping for air. He stumbled onto the pile of cloth he called a bed and tried to steady his breathing. He was fucked. He was in danger from the Elfland kings already, just by the nature of his ancestry, and now had actually drawn their ire. Cut a man that was clearly one of their leaders and stabbed another of them in his attempt to escape. He could stay hidden for a long time in his cave, maybe scrape by and survive, but eventually Head need to go back to the Undermarket or the Maw, and they'd find him. Head made it 5 years, and now it seemed he wouldn't make it another. Fuck, he muttered. He shouldn't even be in the pit. Well, he should, in that Head committed more than enough crimes to earn his time there, but he should never have been captured. If his old crew hadn't fucked him over, he would still be on the streets. Gold in one hand, a woman in the other, a reputation that put fear into people's hearts. Now, he was going to die in the Underprison, unremembered and unremarkable. He let out a frustrated yell and slammed a closed hand down on the stone before putting his face in his hands. There was a squeak from the corner of the room. Dantes looked to see the brown rat there, twitching its whiskers. He sighed, letting his desperation and rage go for a moment, and went over to where his food was stored. He took out a small piece of potato and tossed it to the rat. "Thank you," the rat squeaked. Dantes sighed. "No problem." He blinked and looked at the rat again. "Wait." Dantes looked at the rat, watching as it nibbled on the piece of potato that Head just thrown at him. "Did you just talk?" he asked. The rat stopped eating and swallowed the mouthful of food it had. "Yes." Dantes paused. "And you can understand me?" The rat cocked its head. "Huh. Yeah, I can actually." "Strange." Dantes squinted. The rat looked the same as it had before. It was large, about the size of his foot, and mostly a reddish-brown in color. The same rat that Head grown used to seeing every day. Same one had been feeding for the last few years. Around the same time Head started watering the moss and cultivating mushrooms. "Could you always talk?" "Could you?" "Apparently no, Tat, least not to rats. Your kind can be slow." The rat let out a series of squeaks that reminded Dantes of a mean-spirited laugh. Dantes sat back down. He couldn't really think of anything else to say. His eyes drifted to the little moss tufts growing through the stone nearby. As he looked, he could feel that it needed more water. It was a kind of warm, parched feeling that tingled in the back of his throat. He stood up, grabbed his pitcher, and poured a small bit of water onto it. He could sense gratitude radiating from it, like a cool cloth on the forehead on a hot day. He scanned the rest of the cave. 2 other plants needed watering. The rest were content. The mushrooms wanted more waste, so he obliged them too. Their gratitude felt different, like a group of people were patting him on the back and thanking him all at once. What the fuck? He muttered to himself. He wasn't a mage. He knew just enough about magic to use magical items, but he didn't have the gifts needed to cast spells empty-handed. God's new Head wanted to when he was a kid, but that wasn't the path life had chosen for him. Had heard of a few races that could talk to certain animals. Dragonkin stood out as able to speak with lizards, but he didn't have any such mingling in his own blood. At least not that he knew of. Even if he did, what would that mean? That he had an ancestor that got plowed by a giant rat? At least that would explain his preference for dark alleys instead of well-lit streets. "Could I have some more?" asked the rat. Dantes thought about it and shook his head. "Not today. I may be stuck at the level of supplies I'm currently at for a while. Need to preserve what I can. You should give me more food instead." "Why?" "It sounds like you're likely to die anyway. Your food could last me a long time. You should give it to me." Dantes laughed. "I'm too selfish for that." The rat moved its head in a way that seemed almost like a shrug. "Then I will eat your corpse. Either way, my stomach will be full. You're welcome to it, if it comes to that." Dantes started to walk along the edges of his cave, his fingers tracing the cracks in it as he did so. It was what he usually did when he was feeling anxious or worried. He hadn't done it much in the last year, but the day he knew the elves were after him and he started talking to rats, seemed like a good time to start back up. He didn't think Head gone crazy. Had seen crazy, both in the back alleys of Rendhold and in the pit itself. Broken men weeping openly in the middle of streets, dwarves so terrified of the sky that they covered their heads with dirt, elves so far from their home forest that they broke and covered the walls of their cells in excrement they tried to shape into the image of a tree. His mind still felt clear, sharp, reactive. The world was a large place. Who was to say he didn't gain some ability he hadn't previously known existed? If he had, that ability might be the key to his survival, maybe even more than that. You know, rat, there's a third option for keeping your stomach full. The rat looked at Dantes questioningly. We could continue the arrangement we've always had. I live and give you a bit of food from my stores every day. Yes, and so I do not nibble the flesh from your feet while you sleep. Unauthorized use. This story is on Amazon without permission from the author. Report any sightings. Dantes paused. He hadn't considered that the rat had its own understanding of the deal. He'd have to be wary of that, of his assumptions. His feet tingled a bit, and he flexed his toes within the thin leather of his cheap boots. Well, let's say I could get you more. Food. Would you be able to do me a favor? What kind of food? Do you have a preference? Meat. Dantes gritted his teeth, feeling the small tusks from his Orcish ancestry cut slightly into his cheek. He hadn't expected a rat to drive a hard bargain. Meat was hard to come by. He had a bit preserved with the rest of the food, but it wasn't a lot. At the same time, his life was more valuable to him than meat with the texture of wet wood. I can do that. The rat skittered toward him. Meat first. Dantes smiled and shook his head. Not how I deal. You do the job first, then I'll give you a fourth of the meat I have. Half. A third. Maybe a third. What do you want me to do? Do you know where the Elflin Kings live? What's an elf? At it novel been at. Tall, usually fair, pointed ears, grating voices, probably don't look down long enough to see you. I know the place where they gather. Some of them, the important ones, carry shards of a mirror roughly the size of my hand. The rat nodded. Yes, where the food and good smells come from. Would you be able to retrieve one of those shards for me? Half. The ones with the pointed ears are hard to avoid and crush us beneath their boots when they are able. Dantes clenched and unclenched his fist. Deal. Half. To be paid once I receive the shard. The rat twitched its whiskers thoughtfully. It will be done, but I will wait until they sleep to go to them. I will need some of my siblings to help me. I will tell them that you paid me only a quarter of what I am actually to be paid. I will share that among them. Dantes nodded. Had met some savvy people over the years, but he found himself impressed by the rat had been sharing his food with. Do you have a name? The rat had returned to its small meal of potato. No, rats are known by connections, not names. My sister calls me brother, my mother's son, my cousin, and on and on. Well, we're not kin, and I'd rather not refer to you as just rat. After all, if you're not the only one I can talk to, then it may get confusing as I meet more. True. I would not want you to pay brothers instead of me. They're tricky. How about Jacopo? What is this name? What is its meaning? I don't know. It was the name of my father's ship. Always liked how it sounded. A ship? My great-great-great-grandmother came from ship. This is a good name. All right then, Jacopo. Dantes held out his pinky finger to him. I look forward to a long and mutually beneficial relationship. I have seen this. Jacopo moved closer and gripped Dantes' pinky finger in his claw. Dantes dipped his pinky and nodded at him. Jacopo returned the gesture. It had taken some time, but Dantes' anxiety had eventually turned to exhaustion as he waited for Jacopo to leave on his mission. He forced himself to eat a bit of the food had acquired, focusing on what would expire first, and sat on the pile of cloth that served as his bed. Unlike him, Jacopo seemed completely at ease in spite of the heist head so recently agreed to, alternating between naps, stretching, and more naps until he said his goodbyes and began to make his way to the Elflin King's territory. The day's events had been tiring. Dantes wasn't out of shape, exactly, but he certainly wasn't the same rooftop-hopping man had been before he was thrown into the pit. Years of malnourishment and a lack of exercise had eaten away at him, and as such he felt deep aches and pains through his body as he laid down and closed his eyes. His dreams typically took one of two forms: the shape of his friend's hands in front of him, pushing his ladder away from the rooftop, the sensation of falling endlessly, the pain of landing on his back, or running through the overgrown parts of the city, his hands running along the edges of branches and vines as he ducked into alleys and climbed crumbling walls. This night was different, however. He felt as if he was floating, drifting through blackness. Below him, a scene played out seemingly on repeat. There sat two people, a man and a woman. The man wore a cloak of midnight blue, with silver and gold buckles securing it in place, the hint of a dagger at his waist, and his face concealed beneath a hood, only a smirk showing. Across from him was a woman. She had skin the color of pale wood and hair of deep green. She was smiling as well, but hers was predatory, hungry, and she had one slitted eye like that of a cat, and one eye with a bar of black in the center like that of a goat. Between them was a scale, and each of them would take turns placing something onto it or removing something from it. The scale was overall tilted in the cloaked man's favor, but with each addition, it seemed to be sliding slowly toward the green woman. The moment the scale became even, the dream changed. Jacopo moved with practiced ease through the narrow crevices within the walls. This was his home, and he knew its paths and temperament better than even his ancestors had. He peered out a crack to observe the nearby room. He saw a number of pointy-eared creatures, elves Dantes had called them. He sniffed the air twice, counting around 10 of them gathered, along with the smell of old bread and alcohol. There would be crumbs and puddles to sip from aplenty when they were done. Jacopo was after a different prize, though, and slipped through more narrow cracks. He would tell a cousin of the bounty that awaited there if one was careful. After a few more narrow tunnels, he reached another crack wide enough to exit through. He inhaled again. This time he could smell something sweet. Looking through the crack, he saw fewer elves, maybe 3. 2 were sleeping, and one was sitting at a stone desk, making marks on a piece of paper in that strange ritual the creatures with 2 legs seemed to enjoy. On top of that desk was a glint, a fist-sized chunk of mirror-reflecting candlelight. Jacopo had located his target. He slid out of the hole, making a soft thud as he landed. It was almost too quiet for an elf to hear, almost. The elf at the desk's ear twitched, and he turned to where Jacopo had been only a moment before, but had already hidden himself in the shadows of a nearby bed. Elf eyes could see in the dark well enough, but they had difficulty in rooms full of light and shadow in equal proportion. Jacopo looked up at the crack and, with a subtle twitch of his whiskers, called sister and brother from it. Sister dropped down and swiftly made for a small pile of books near the elf. It was a bold move, but it paid off when the elf looked at the crack in the wall again rather than the pile of books near his feet. Brother hesitated at the hole, waiting for the elf to drop his guard again. Jacopo moved slowly, but surely to the stone desk. It wasn't smoothly carved, thankfully. The hairy short ones in the tunnels at the far end from these elves tended to carve stone too smoothly for him to climb, but this was full of the little imperfections that seemed almost made for his paws as he slowly scaled it. Getting into the room and locating the shard was the easy part. Getting out with the shard would be a different story. He reached the top of the desk and peered slowly over it. The elf still hadn't taken notice of him or sister and had returned to his writing. His face was lined heavily, which seemed strange to Jacopo, who had only ever seen those with pointed ears of smooth, unlined faces. Jacopo needed a distraction. He slid back down to the side of the desk and twitched his whiskers at Brother, encouraging him to leap down. Brother was foolish and complied. This time, the elf took full notice, seeing Brother before he could hide. The elf stood up from his desk and moved quickly toward him. While he was distracted, Jacopo moved quickly, but silently, locking his feet into the stone as he slid the mirror shard off the desk. Sister was below him and caught it as it fell. The edges were wrapped in leather aside from a single half-inch of its edge that was uncovered and seemed to have been sharpened into a rough blade. Brother joined Sister, and they began moving along the edge of the wall with their prize, Sister moving backward with the leather in her teeth, and Jacopo moving forward. At it novel been at. They reached the doorway just in time to watch as Brother was smashed by the old elf's black boots. Jacopo didn't stop moving. He had other brothers, and besides, this meant less meat he'd need to share. He and his sister moved along the edges of the series of rooms the Elfland kings called home. At this time of night, most of them were sleeping, drunk, or focused on other pursuits. If Jacopo encountered any real trouble, he would simply drop the mirror and run. Better hungry and alive than dead It wasn't worth dying over some meat, though clearly brother had had a different opinion. Luckily, he and sister made it out of the Elfland King's territory without any more trouble, and skittered through the dark. This story has been stolen from Royal Road. If you read it on Amazon, please report it. Dantes awoke in the usual dank gloom of his cave. He could see well in the dark, as a benefit of his mixed heritage, but for some reason that day, it took his eyes several moments longer to adjust. He looked down at his hands. They were no longer small and pink with long, delicate fingers, but were back to normal. Light gray, the color of concrete, with slender but strong fingers perfect for climbing up walls or carefully removing a coin purse. There were no longer whiskers in his field of vision either, and a stream of consciousness that included thoughts that both were and were not as had ended. That dream had been strange. Both of them had. One had felt ethereal and disconnected, as dreams always do, but the other had been vivid and clear. He could still even picture the writing the elf had been doing that Jacopo had ignored. It had been in elvish, which he could not read, but the symbols on the paper were still crystal clear to him. He took a sharp stone and carved them as best he could into the wall before they left his mind. Had it been stress that had brought on those strange dreams, or did they mean something else? Had been able to feel what the plants around him needed, and talk to Jacopo as if he were a man. He turned his attention to the plants again, but felt only mild contentment aside from a desire for sunlight, which he could not provide, though he empathized with. If that ability was still there, that further solidified the fact that he had not yet succumbed to madness. He looked at the plants again. He wasn't certain, but it seemed as if the moss had crept a full inch further along the ground than where it had been when Head gone to sleep. He went to examine it more closely, but before he reached it, he heard something moving through the narrow entrance to his cave. He turned to see Jacopo, his dark brown fur glistening slightly with the condensation of the walls, and Jacopo's sister, just as Head seen her in his dreams, carrying the mirror between them. Dantes added, dreaming through the eyes of rats, to his rapidly expanding list of strange powers he had no understanding of. "You have it?" he asked, crouching down to look more closely at the mirror. He reached for it, but Jacopo and his sister hurriedly moved it out of his reach. "Meet first." Dantes nodded. He had never seen one of the mirrors in person, but given where it had been when Jacopo had stolen it, and what Head heard, it matched his expectations. He went over to where he stored his food, removed the heavy rock, and gathered a fraction of the meat Head promised, placing it on the ground between them. "Your payment." Jacopo's whiskers twitched at the meat, but he gave no indication Head realized that it was less than promised. "Your half," he said, sliding some of it over to his sister. She made a noise that Dantes recognized as a confirmation, took her half, and skittered away into the darkness. Jacopo turned his attention to Dantes. "The rest of my payment." Dantes nodded, returned to the store, and laid another small portion of meat in front of him. Jacopo didn't move toward it, instead fixing Dantes with a stare that somehow reminded him of the face his mother would make when a client tried to short her. He felt a pang of guilt for comparing her to a rat, but returned to the food storage and brought out the rest of the meat he owed. It was silly, he realized, to be making a deal with a rat. He could simply smash him with a rock and keep the meat for himself, but that wasn't how he liked to do business. Sure, Head tried a short payment, but offering none at all and betraying the person with whom Head made the deal, that was a good way to build a bad rep, and now that he could talk to rats, he definitely wanted them on his side. This time Jacopo accepted. Had been keeping track of the amount of food Dantes had in his store for a long time, and so knew exactly how much meat Head stored. Head half expected him to attack and betray him. It was what another rat may have done, but this was better. He enjoyed the arrangement he had with Dantes. Easy sources of food were hard to come by. Dantes lifted the mirror, looking at his gray, skinned reflection. He was a midtown, mutt all the way through. Gray skin, small tusks fighting to get past his lips, pointed ears. Average looks overall. The only thing that set him apart were his gold eyes, and even those weren't too uncommon. His mother had told him they came from his father's Orcish side, but had met him so few times he couldn't remember what Head looked like at all, much less the color of his eyes. He looked into the mirror again. He was gaunt, frail compared to how had been the last time had seen a clear reflection of himself. He felt the weight of the mirror in his hand, the weight of his life in his hands. Dantes turned the mirror over in his hands, looking for some kind of activation rune, but found nothing. He could tell the item was magical. There was a feeling to things that had magic. It presented differently for everyone. Some people heard a low hum. Others said the air around magic smelled like the air before a storm. Others would feel a chill up their spine. For Dantes, it was a tingling in the tips of his fingers. He felt that sensation keenly as he held the mirror. His attention turned to the mirror's exposed edge, the only portion that wasn't obscured by leather. It had been shaved down to a sharp blade, and when he looked at it closely, he saw small brown stains he recognized as dried blood. He began to press his thumb into the edge, but hesitated. He was eager. It was the first taste of power Head had in some time, the first true heist Head been a part of. He needed to calm himself. He longed to use the mirror, but magic could be dangerous, and he had no idea exactly how the mirror functioned or exactly what might be waiting for him on the other side. Even if he turned it on, it wasn't as if gold would start to flow from it. It was just a connection to another mirror outside the prison, not a tool for wish fulfillment. He needed to resist the desire to rush things and gather more information. There were a number of people he could bring the mirror to, but only one he could think of that owed him a favor. Dantes slid the mirror into one of the many folds of his coat, slotted a few shivs into his boots, and slid out of his cave. He didn't head straight toward the Collards' territory. They were the gang he got along best with, but that didn't mean he trusted them. Head trusted his gang, and they'd gotten him thrown into this shithole. He had no desire to be betrayed again. He wove through a few narrow caverns and corridors, skirting around kobold territory just in case the elves had put any kind of bounty on his head. Kobolds were good neighbors. They rarely bothered him when they encountered one another. He got along with the ones that traded, and they could be relied on to perform any job they'd agreed to, up to their understanding of that agreement. They'd still slit his throat for the right price, though, and they knew enough about the general area in which he lived that they could place some of their trademark traps to catch him off guard if they truly wanted to. He stopped in an offshoot cave that stopped in a dead end. He peeled away a piece of stone from the wall. Inside was a small pouch that he knew contained a small portion of food, a shiv, and a bottle of clear hooch. He slid the mirror into the compartment and then sealed it back up. He had a half-dozen such hiding places in the pit. He was hardly the only prisoner that had the idea, but he was fairly certain he was the only one that had so many scattered in the outermost tunnels of the pit. Most prisoners preferred company, even bad company, to being alone, particularly with the many stories about the dark things that lived in the furthest reaches of the Underprison. Had heard stories of everything from undead to floating skulls wrapped in fire, and even that the original denizens of the Underprison, those beings that had their city here before Rendhold was built on top of it, were waiting in the darkest depths to pounce. So far, had only encountered rats, giant spiders, and the occasional skitterling. With the mirror stored safely in his hidey hole, he began making his way to the Collards' territory. He took a familiar route there, moving carefully so that his own footsteps wouldn't be so loud that he couldn't hear anyone else approaching him. As he moved, he continued to experiment with his newfound senses. He could feel a patch of black fungus on a far wall, and its craving to spread. He caught snippets of conversation from rats that skittered away as he approached, and he even thought he could sense that Jacopo was still close by, though exactly where he wasn't certain. He wasn't sure of what ways he could use those abilities to benefit himself, aside from more deals with rats, but any edge was better than none, and he was confident He'd find a way to take advantage of it. He reached the edges of the Collards' territory. It was composed of a large cavern, with dozens of small chambers that served as individual rooms. There were many such chambers in the pit, which had led many to presume they'd been sleeping chambers for whatever society had initially carved them long before Rendhold was built atop it. The Collards' territory included a small freshwater fountain at its center, the source of which was unknown, but they'd managed to use it to create a crude plumbing of sorts all throughout their space. A few other gangs had been envious of it, but the value of being closer to the maw was higher than a source of fresh water, and it wasn't worth dividing their forces to hold more than a single area at a time. If you spot this story on Amazon, know that it has been stolen. Report the violation. There was a single sleeping former mage leaning against the wall with his head tucked downward. That was typical. The collard had much more to worry about coming from the other direction. Still, Dantes decided to help the young guard pay more attention next time. He noticed a slightly raised outline at the side of the boy's robe. Quickly and deftly, he slid his hand into the robe, found a pocket, and pulled out a small book. He recognized it as a grimoire. He was disappointed for a moment. There were few things more useless to him than that. Then he realized it was lighter than he expected. He opened it and turned a few pages to reveal a concealed compartment. Inside were 3 pieces of silver and a small pouch of dust. He smiled, claimed all of it, then slipped the book back into the boy's pocket, added novel Bennett at. Once that was done, he walked into the main room. Keeping his head up, he wasn't exactly hiding who he was, but he wasn't making show of being there either. He exchanged a few nods and a wave. Near Televor's chamber was a table at which 4 men were shooting dice. 1 was a gnome, 2 were humans, and 1 was an orc. All 4 wore the telltale bronze collars. The orc waved. Dantes, care to join us for a bit of gambling? I'd always care to take your goods from you, Wayne, but am busy today. Their table was probably Dantes' 3rd favorite. The stakes were low since they didn't have much to gamble with to begin with. But on the other hand, the stakes were low, so why bother gambling? Aside from that, Dantes didn't care for many of the regulars aside from Wayne and Tell. Though taking money from people you dislike was certainly its own entertainment. The gnome moved one of the dice between his fingers, trying to find some way for the Elfland kings to leave you be. Dantes turned his attention to him. Pillion, news travels fast. Sometimes it can travel very fast. Where people rest their heads, the tunnels they tend to pass through. He gave him a knowing look. Of course, for the right price, maybe that news doesn't travel. Dantes felt a scowl shaping on his face, his small tusks pushing against his lips. He fought it down and took a deep breath. This was normal. It was a good play, one he may have made himself in Pillion's position. He knelt down to look him in the eyes. Pillion, we don't really know each other beyond a few games of dice. All you know about where I live is that it's somewhere in the tunnels beyond collar territory. You don't know how close or far or how hidden or even if I sleep in only one place. When you tell the Elfland kings where you think you can find me, and they come up empty-handed, or worse, I manage to kill one of them, do you think they'll treat you kindly? Do you think if I survive that you'll remain secure with a bit of extra weed in your pocket to lose on dice? That collar isn't so thick that it will keep your throat from being slit. You do well to remember that. Pillion scoffed and made a rude gesture, but couldn't help bringing his hand up to his collar and rubbing his neck gingerly. Dantes turned to Wayne. Is Tell in his room? Wayne nodded. Yeah, been sleeping since he got back, though. Seemed real dehydrated as well. Must have drank an entire pitcher of water. We thought he may have traded away the last of his goods for 1 too many stiff drinks. Dantes laughed. It wasn't drinks. I introduced him to sin. Wayne laughed too. Ah, well, I think I remember my first visit to Witch Wench. I managed to hold out for a year and couldn't walk right for a week afterward. Disgusting, muttered Pillion as he placed his dice into the cup and began shaking them. Dantes shook his head, not willing to expend any more time on Pillion, and walked to Telephone's room. If Pillion was trying to extort him, that likely meant that someone else among the collard had already told the Elfland kings all that they knew about him and where he was. The longer he took to figure things out, the harder it would be to maneuver, and the more limited his options would become. He needed to speed things up. He reached Telephone's room and slid the small curtain to his side. Telephone's room was much as Dantes had expected it to be. A small stack of books in one corner, crudely carved incantations along the surface of the walls, a cushion on the floor, and a pile of them in the corner atop, which Tell laid, snoring softly. Dantes knocked on the wall with his knuckles in an attempt to wake him, but he didn't stir. Well, I tried, he thought before giving into his natural instincts and beginning a search of the room. Among the books, he found nothing uncommon, which was likely how Tell had afforded them. though he did find some tasteful charcoal etchings of horned women in scintillating poses that piqued his interest hidden between the pages of a few. He left those alone and searched around the rest of the room. Beneath the pillow he found a single cigarette, and in a corner he found a small barrel that had just enough food to last him another week. Tell hadn't been kidding when Head spoken of how broke he was. Still, the Collard looked out for each other. It wasn't as dire as it would have been if Dante's own supplies had dwindled to that point. Once Head found everything of value, he left it where it was. He was just staying sharp. Besides, he wouldn't steal anything when Tell had so little. It would almost certainly be noticed. With nothing left to do, Dantes lightly kicked Tell on his bed. Once I rest a few moments, he'll be able to go again. Let me just catch my breath, he muttered tiredly. Dantes kicked him more firmly. This time he didn't even react. Dantes moved over to the stack of books, lifted the heaviest of them, some thick tome written in scratchy text, and slammed it next to Telephone's head. "Professor, I swear I was awake." He blinked a few times and looked at Dantes. "Oh, that's right, I'm in prison." He sighed. "I was having the most wonderful dream. Spare me the details." He rubbed his eyes. "I have to thank you for introducing me to Sin. That was the best night I've had in a long time. She did this thing with her. Spare me those details as well." Dantes hadn't enjoyed hearing about people's sexual escapades outside of the pit, and he definitely didn't want to hear anything about the depravities that were happening inside of it. "Wait, why are you here? I couldn't find you after I left the brothel." Didn't search long, though, to be honest. The whole undermarket seemed to be having a fit. "Did you hear any specifics?" "No, just lots of pissed-off elves, or people trying to avoid pissed-off elves. The elves wouldn't talk to me since I'm half-souled, and everyone else wouldn't talk to me because they thought I was with the other elves." Well, I'm sure it's not important," Dantes said smoothly. He wanted Tell focused. If he got him excited about his situation, it might make it harder for him to get what he wanted or make him hesitant to be seen with him. "I need to call on that favor you owe me." Tell stood and stretched, his joints popping loudly as his long frame reached up and touched the ceiling of his cell. "Any chance it can wait? I'll need to figure out whatever busy work I need to do for Merle to earn some extra food this month." "Unless you've got a lead?" Dantes shook his head. "No leads for you. I introduced you to Sin. That was the cost, and I already paid it at Novel Benet. And if I refuse, I suppose it's a beating?" Dantes shrugged. "Reputation is important. Though, since it would be the second time I'd probably need to stab you." Tell grimaced. "I really don't want to be stabbed." Dantes nodded. "Few people do, though a lot of people act like it's exactly what they're looking for." He bent down and grabbed a blue cloak from the floor, tossing it to Tell, who managed to catch it by the hood. "Let's go." Tell began sliding on the cloak. All right. What is it you need from me?" "This tale has been pilfered from Royal Road. If found on Amazon, kindly file a report. Just need you to take a look at something. Tell me what you think of it." Telephone's eyes lit up. "Is it something Ma-dash?" "No." Dantes quickly lied, adding a bit of exasperation to his tone in order to sell it. Mentioning magic items among the Collard was a surefire way to get himself unwanted attention. Not to mention, if the elves began searching for their missing shard of mirror, it wouldn't take long for people to put two and two together with him as the result. "Just some writing on a side passage I need translated. Old prisoner writing, not old enough to be original to the wall." Many portions of the pit were coded in the script of its original inhabitants, and those areas that were blank were often filled with the script of prisoners who wanted to mark an important passage, a place something was hidden, or a place to avoid. Often they led on worthless treasure hunts with no reward. Equally as often they led into some unreachable hole where a man would be lost to time, but sometimes you could find a cache of old liquor or weapons or any number of other things. There were stories of such notes leading to enormous changes in the power structure of the pit, or even an escape from it. All of that made a solid enough lie. "You know, I could teach you to read a few other languages. It's not too hard, and it's not like we don't have the time. I already speak universal languages." "Oh," asked Tell as they left his cell and began descending toward the tunnel Dantes had arrived from. "Love, money, and violence." Tell chuckled. "You know, you'd have gotten along well with the demons I summoned during my studies. They'll take that as a compliment." He sensed some kind of change in air and turned his focus to the far tunnels. Movement he could feel, but not hear or see. In and around the walls, heading toward them. It took him a moment to realize that it was rats. He could practically feel their small paws dancing across his feet as they ran, their whiskers brushing against his leg. No one else seemed to notice it, so he stayed calm and continued walking out. Whatever was happening, he couldn't see much value in being there when it went down. The sleeping guard was now awake at the back entrance and furiously scouring the ground, his grimoire held loosely in his hand. "You lose something, Sal?" asked Tell. Yeah, just a bit of weed," he lied. "Need help finding it?" Dantes shook his head at Telephone's naivete. He's going to say no, because he thinks we'll steal it if we find it. And he's right. "Let's get going." Sal gave Tell a small apologetic nod in agreement to what Dantes had said, and then they left him behind as Dantes began to sense the rats scatter into the myriad small invisible tunnels around the collard. They walked into the dark passages, Tell ducking where Dantes could walk straight, as he guided him through the side passageways and cracks that he routinely navigated. Areas where the once perfect stone hallways had been destroyed by whatever cataclysm had killed the culture that had carved them. Dantes considered bringing up his newfound abilities to Tell. They were clearly magical in some way, even if he himself was still not a mage. As he considered it, though, he decided he'd rather keep it to himself. It had more value as a secret, and he didn't trust anyone to keep a secret like that to themselves. "How is it that you know where you're going? Do you have some kind of marker you use?" asked Tell as they walked through a passage, picking cobwebs off his robe with a look of clear discomfort on his face. "No, any marker I could see, someone else could use to follow me." "So it's just memory then?" Dantes nodded. "Partially memory, yeah. There are a few tricks to navigating that can be learned with practice." Tell waited for Dantes to elaborate, but he didn't. He'd earned those skills and was hesitant to share them when they provided him one of the few edges he had in the pit. His skill at navigating the tunnels had come from a conversation Head had with the dwarf when Head first arrived. Had been playing dice with him when the dwarf had begun talking about how his people would dig out their cave cities. That reminded Dantes of a simple fact. The pit wasn't random. It had been built and carved for a purpose, one that had existed long before it had been a prison. Once he understood that, the layout he had in his mind began to click. Even the collapses and cracks could be made sense of with a bit of context. They reached the small dead-end cave that Dantes had stored the mirror in. "Perhaps your vision is better than mine, but I see no writing here." Telephone's eyes narrowed, and he began backing toward the exit. "Oh gods, you're going to try to take me as a woman, aren't you? That's what this is about." Dantes brought his hand to his face and slowly slid it down, sighing the whole time. "You know I'm friends with the changelings. If I want to spend time with a man in that way, I would ask one of them." "Oh, right. You probably should be more cautious about following other men into darkened tunnels. Your virtue aside, you could easily be stabbed, robbed, and left for dead. You've given me a lot to think about these last few days." Dantes shook his head and approached the stone on the wall. He removed it and pulled out the mirror, holding it out to Televor. Telephone's eyes widened, and he brought it to his nose, inhaling deeply. "Roast meat. Gods, I miss that smell." "Roast meat?" asked Dantes. "Yes, that's what magic smells like to me," said Televor, turning the mirror over in his hands. "And this smells to me like a lady of the hearth feast to end all feasts. Don't get too attached. You'll be keeping that once you're done helping me. This is what you needed? For me to decipher its use? I have a general idea of its use. It's meant to transfer goods from outside the prison. There's a small gap in the leather frame that I think is meant to be touched by blood to activate it, but I decided against testing it myself. Magic mirrors. Elven then, or some other kind of fey creature." He ran a finger gently across the mirror's surface. "Old magic, but broken somehow." Dantes raised an eyebrow. The answer to this somehow was obvious considering Tell was holding a broken shard of mirror. He stayed silent, though. No reason to ruin Telephone's fun, and he wasn't sure if breaking his flow would slow him down or break his concentration. Tell brought the mirror to his nose, gave it a few cursory sniffs, then licked across its surface with his tongue. This made Dantes raise his other eyebrow, and his eyes widened when the mirror gave off a brief warm glow. "You were right to not use your own blood. It would have resulted in a tremendous expulsion of power. You'd likely be dead. Dantes swallowed. The only way to activate it is with pure elven blood. Anything less results in the power within the mirror exiting violently, in proportion to how much elven blood you have. He paused to laugh. I suppose I'd only be half dead if I tried it. What exactly does it do after it's activated? It's a portal. Well, originally it was a portal. Elfland has several mirrors like this, unbroken of course. They're portals back to the original realm from which the elves hail. Though they obviously don't take many trips back, what with the cataclysm and all. A trip back would mean almost instant death for any that tried. They'd be devoured by the darkness that had slept in their own hearts, as my grandma would say when talking about Elfland. He shook his head wistfully. She was such a nice woman. What does that mean for the one that Shard is a part of? Well, because it's broken, it can only link with other pieces of itself. I imagine that you put a piece of paper through it, and whatever other piece it's linked to receive the message, and they send whatever was requested back. Dantes clenched his jaw. It could only be activated by pure elven blood. They likely only communicated through it in elvish script, not to mention that was likely coded on top of that. That limited his options with it severely. He was left with a piece of magic that he could use as either a bomb or a bargaining chip. It wasn't the full potential Head been looking for, but considering his only investment into acquiring it had been a small pile of dried meat, Head come out on top. It could still be all he needed to secure his protection from the kings, but had need to play things right and get incredibly lucky. Tell paused mid-sniff as he was looking at the mirror, his happy expression at being able to enjoy closeness to magic again, slowly turning to a frown. Wait, where did you get this? From the Elven Kings. They didn't give it to you, did they? Afraid not. By the ether, they're going to cut you groin to throat. Shit, they're going to cut me groin to throat. Don't worry, they don't know I stole it. There's no way for them to trace its loss back to me unless you say something. Tell nodded slowly, letting out a sigh. You're sure? There's no way they're after you for it? Dantes shook his head. Not for it, no. The narrative has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the infringement. Tell nodded and stopped. Wait, what do you mean by that? Dantes sighed. Tell was learning. It was a thing equally detrimental and beneficial to him all at once. I got into a fight outside the Witch Wench. Wound up being pushed into some new hot shit Elfland King's leader and accidentally slashed his face with a shiv. Ran away and embarrassed a few of them in the process, stabbed one of them. And your solution is to steal this from them? Won't they be far more upset about that? Yes, but as I mentioned, they don't know I'm the one who took it. Couldn't you have just gone to them? Throw yourself at their mercy? Take a quick severe beating and then crawl away to recover? You maybe could do that with the protection of the collared and half-elven blood. Me? It's not an option. Even buying them off would be almost impossible for a mutt like me. I don't exactly have bars of gold and virginal elven women on hand to trade. Tell stared worriedly at the mirror in his hands. Had just been salivating over it. But now he looked as if its touch was actually painful to him. Dantes held out a hand. Listen, you held out your end of the bargain and honored the favor I asked of you. Your part ends here. I can handle myself, and the information you've given me should help. Tell nodded reluctantly and handed Dantes the mirror. Okay, but if they ask, I won't tell them where to find you. Dantes chuckled. Very noble, but you don't know where to find me anyway. He took a breath and let it out. They'll guide you back. I need to think through my next moves. Tell nodded, and Dantes put the mirror back in its hiding spot before he began leading him through the tunnels. He took a different route back. He didn't think Tell would sell him out on purpose, but he couldn't fully trust him and wanted to be sure he wouldn't be able to make his way back to the mirror without him. At one point, they entered a large antechamber, with rows and rows of benches hewn from the stone of the pit itself. Ornate carvings and strange geometric patterns lined the walls, and the ceilings were so high they got lost in the dark. Dantes had another strange feeling. It was similar to the rats, but different at the same time. Head felt the rats running along his feet. Now he could swear he was being lightly slapped in the face by something. He heard a flap of wings above and realized it was bats, and they were nervous. He didn't hesitate, instead pulling Tell down behind one of the stone pews. Wah! Dantes held up a finger and gestured for him to stay low, and held his breath drawing his shiv. Just then, two elves began to walk through the same chamber. They moved silently, with one wielding a thin sword, and another holding a wickedly curved dagger. They scanned the room, then nodded at one another, sheathing their weapons. Could have sworn I heard footsteps. Might, the echoes down here can linger for a long time. Could have been the steps of a man long dead. One of them looked up as if beseeching the gods. When I'm stuck down here as long as you, will I also become unbearably fucking creepy about everything? That, or mad, or dead. There was an audible sigh. That one's on me. I asked and got another creepy answer. I accept responsibility for that. The other one nodded sagely. It's normal to be nervous when you first arrive in the pit. We're meant for rich forests, not deep dungeons. This is the realm of bottom-feeding lesser races, like the dwarves and kobolds. Yeah. We're the best, they're the worst. I don't see why we're doing this in the first place. So some asshole fell into Riavare, nicked him a bit, stabbed a 3/4 blooded mouth breather, and ran away when he was chased. I say we let him alone. He'll come back toward the maw eventually, and then we jump him there, kill him, and move on. I agree with you. But a Grand Duke of Spring was cut by a mixed beast. He is fresh to the pit and impatient. All affronts feel particularly offending to him, deep within his core. This will fade as he settles into the way of things here, and we will be better off for it. And in the meantime, we kill this mutt. Dantes? Yes. Even if his temper cooled, he is given an order. He will not back off on it unless absolutely necessary. You've seen this kind of thing a few times, huh? At novel been at. Many times. The new dukes are sent down to run operations here. They learn valuable lessons. They leave. The cycle repeats. Any chance any of us regulars get to leave with him? It has happened. There was a sigh. It would probably help my chances if I killed him outright. It's likely. All right, fuck it then. Let's check the next chamber. The elves walked down the long room, past the pew where Dantes and Tell were hiding, and off into the darkness of the deeper caverns that they'd come from. They sat there for several minutes, wary of the sensitivity of elf ears before they let out a loud exhalation of breath almost simultaneously. Let's move, said Dantes, standing up and dragging Tell to his feet. You're fucked. Absolutely fucked, said Tell, as Dantes lead him through the remaining passages to collared territory. Probably, but it's not your problem, so don't worry about it. They ducked beneath a collapsed section of wall and into a tight hallway. They had actual blades, not just whittled down pieces of old metal, fresh iron, hot from the forge. All the gangs have access to real weapons except the orcs, though they've likely stolen a fair amount over time. He ignored the hot from the forge comment. It wasn't exactly surprising that a half-elf who went to the academy didn't know anything about forging. They even said that there's no way that their leader is going to back off. I mean, hunting for you in the outer parts of the pit? He wants you dead yesterday. That's about how long it's been, yes. You're just screwed. Not to mention what might happen if they find out it was you that took the mirror. I don't think they'll stop at just killing you. The edges of collared territory started to come into view, and Dantes let out a long sigh and a short prayer thanking the Pathfinder for her mercy. He had quickly tired of Telephone's ongoing rambling regarding his fate. He was well aware of the danger he was in without being told every moment. This is where we split, he said, gesturing for Tell to move on. Oh, you're sure you don't need help? I almost definitely do, but not from you. You've done what I needed. Go back to your cell and pretend you don't know me. But what's your plan? At it novel been at. Don't worry about it. Really, you'll either be fine or I won't. Don't count on anything either way. Tell nodded, a glum expression on his face. Okay, had been afraid at first, but now he seemed almost willing to go to bat for him. It was always one step forward and two steps back when it came to him figuring out how things worked down there, and even with his growing cynicism, Dantes could see the flickers of idealism peek through in him every once in a while. Televor walked back toward his cell, stopping once to look back, but Dantes had already left. He moved through the caverns, back toward the mirror. He took the passages he knew would be the most difficult to traverse in order to reduce the chances that he'd be found by or accidentally stumble into the elves that were hunting him. He made it back to where Head hid in the mirror and took it along with half of the rations Head had hidden there, some mixed nuts and dried fruit. He snacked as he moved, trying to keep his energy up. It was going to be a long day. He knew He'd be in danger, but hadn't predicted that the kings would use their resources to this degree hunting him. Head thought that at worst He'd need to avoid the areas that they congregated and be wary when traveling near their territory. Now that he was being actively pursued, he needed to move forward quickly. He had, as far as he could tell, two options with the mirror that could save him. One would be to trade the mirror to another gang, explain how it works, and offer it as a trade for protection. The other would be to bleed on it, chuck it into the Elfland King's leadership, and when it exploded, hope that the problem was taken care of. Option 1 was definitely the one he felt was more likely to work. When it came to which gangs he should go to with his offer, his choices were limited. The small folk consortium had their own ways to bring things in, and also not much to offer in terms of protection. The orcs had plenty of protection to offer, but couldn't be counted on to honor any deals he made with them. They would see him as too elvish for that. The kobolds were a possibility, but between the cultural divide with how they perceived agreements and their likely lack of interest in what the mirror could do, it was uncertain they'd care. The collar just didn't have the strength to back him up, though he was certain they would. That left clan Stone Dust, the dwarven gang, they had the strength to back him up and would likely be interested in the mirror, if only as a way to fuck with the kings. If you spot this story on Amazon, know that it has been stolen. Report the violation. He had two ways to get to the dwarves. One will be to make his way toward the maw and through the undermarket. A risky proposition given that the kings were actively searching for him. The other option was to take side passages that slowly looped around. He'd be crossing primarily through kobold territory. The kobolds themselves were relatively neutral to him and would likely leave him be, but the myriad traps they liked to leave in their territory would be another story. He needed to regroup, to check on his resources and determine what the best path would be. He continued maneuvering through the tunnels, old halls, and ruined passageways. His senses were still occasionally flashing with insights into the life that surrounded him. Rats, roaches, mold, all of it seemed to have something to say to him. The darkness was full of life, hungry, horny, scared, warm, cold, dying, being born. He couldn't really control the flow of these impressions, so he decided to focus on the task at hand. To a certain extent, he knew that he was putting off dealing with something that was going to turn out to be incredibly important, but time was a factor. It had gone from something he had too much of to something he had in short supply. He reached his cave some time later and sat on his bed, taking a few moments to catch his breath. Jacopo crawled out of the darkness in the corner of the cave and approached Dantes expectantly. Dantes took a large nut he still had left and handed it to him. "Thanks." Dantes nodded. The ritual was no different than it had always been. The only difference was that he understood what Jacopo was saying. He looked around his cave, his home for the last 4 years. The plants had definitely grown since had been in the cave last. The moss that had always looked frail and a bit brown was now a lush green color and starting to creep across the floor, spreading its tendrils. Had always been impressed at their surviving, but now they seemed to actually be thriving. There was only the smallest sliver of light that came into his home from one of the purple crystals that emitted light high above him and behind a crack in the wall. The light was probably indetectable to those without the sensitivity to light his eyes had. It wasn't sunlight, though, so only the hardiest plants could survive there. He had no clue how the light worked, even after the centuries since its original inhabitants had vanished. But the pit was a strange place that didn't always seem to follow the rules of the world above, particularly when you reached the deeper passages. He stood up and removed the rock that guarded his larder. He took out the fruit head stolen only a little over a day before. It still felt firm in his hand and smelled vaguely of dirt. He took a large bite, chewing it slowly and savoring it. Fruit, like meat, was a delicacy in the pit. Fresh fruit was even more rare. He finished the peach he was eating and moved on to the grapes, tossing one to Jacopo. Then finally he ate the apple that remained. By the time he was done, his hands were sticky, but his stomach was full and his taste buds alight with the pleasures of a rare treat. He went over to the pitcher he kept in the center of his cave, where it collected water. He poured some into a small clay bowl and used that water to clean himself. He then poured what remained in the bowl into those patches of moss he could sense were thirsty. Once that was done, he returned to the pitcher and quenched his own thirst. That's when he sensed something else. Jacopo had moved to where the scraps of the fruit had fallen from Dantes' mouth and hands and was gnawing on the peach pit. Dantes could feel something from the pit. From all the seeds Head spat or placed into a small pile as Head eaten, there was a spark, the faintest glimmer of life. He moved closer to them and picked each of them up in his hand. They craved dirt, sunlight, water, fertilizer. The desires radiating from them felt to him like the cries of the other kids Head watched for his mother's co-workers at the brothel. Those women had forgotten to drink the concoction the madam provided for them, or had children from before they'd begun their new line of work. He held them in his hand. He couldn't give them a lot of light, but he had a feeling, an intuition that they would accept something else. He wasn't sure where the instinct came from, but he followed it just as he had the other ones that had so recently become a part of him. He walked out of his cave, squeezing through the narrow entrance, and moved through a few smaller halls and passages until he came to a large, high-ceilinged room. The cracks in the floor here were wider than any other nearby area, and he could actually see a small amount of dirt through them. He found several spots throughout the chamber and planted each seed. He then watered each of them. He took a shiv from his hand and pricked the tip of his thumb. The sun was a source of light and life. He couldn't provide the light, but life he could do, even if it was only symbolic. He squeezed the wound over each seed and could feel the gratitude come off of each of the seeds in waves as his blood reached them. Once he was done, he noticed Jacopo sitting on a nearby stone, watching him. "You are strange," and beginning to think so too. Jacopo held out the peach pit Head been gnawing on. "This one as well." Dantes took the seed and buried it with the others. Once he was done following through with the odd compulsion, he felt surprisingly revitalized, as if the planting Head done had been restorative for him somehow. That didn't seem right, but whatever his new abilities were, he didn't know all the rules yet, and that meant all he could do was roll with it until the pieces all came into place. Or ask someone, but he was still of the mind that he needed to play things as close to the chest as possible. Head decided, in the midst of his gardening, that taking the long way through kobold territory was his best option for reaching clan Stone Dust territory. There was a chance he could slink through the center of the pit without getting noticed. He was as nondescript as they came. Average height, nothing that really made him stand out, but elves, particularly elfling kings, had a way of noticing every peculiar thing about anyone that wasn't an elf. The exact type of point at his ears were the gray shade of his skin, the shape of his skull. They were freaks about that kind of thing. Head bet his life that he could slip through a group of orcs, kobolds, or dwarves, but with the elven obsession with people's physical characteristics, it was just too great of a risk. He checked his gear. He still had his 2 shivs and the rest of his typical kit. Aside from that, he searched around until he located a long, slender metal rod. He wasn't sure of what its original purpose was, but had found a useful method for searching for traps or checking for instability when moving through some of the deeper tunnels in the pit. He also grabbed a few small, slender pieces of scrap metal that Head managed to shave down over time into serviceable lockpicks. It would be easier, of course, to simply trigger any traps he found at a distance, and then move through the space without a care, but that was a surefire way to piss off the kobolds. They didn't mind someone disarming their traps, that made them see you as an equal. To outright destroy them, though, that was an affront that they would find completely unacceptable. Dantes would obviously destroy them if he had no choice, but since they were some of his closest neighbors and a force in their own right within the pit, he saw no reason to antagonize them. He moved to slip out through the crack that led to his cave and heard Jacopo moving quietly behind him. Once he was through, he turned to look at the large brown rat. "Are you coming with me?" "Yes." "Why?" The rat cleaned its whiskers thoughtfully. "I want to." "Why do you want to?" "It's not that I mind the company. I'm just surprised." He wouldn't have wanted Telephone's help for this particular journey, but Jacopo? He likely knew the tunnels as well, if not better than Dantes did. Not to mention, he may help him notice traps he might not see otherwise. He wasn't so naive as to be unaware of the risks he was undertaking, and the rat had been nothing but savvy since he first started speaking to him. The thought made Dantes smirk. He imagined Tell would be a bit offended that he'd prefer a rat's help to his. But in some ways, Dantes was closer to a rat anyway. Not sure. Just want to. Dantes nodded. You're welcome to. I'm headed through kobold territory. Kobold? Big lizards that walk on two legs. Taller than a dwarf, a bit shorter than me. Jacopo nodded exactly as someone new to the gesture might. Yes. Very dangerous. Lost father to one of their traps. Unauthorized use of content. If you find this story on Amazon, report the violation. Well, hopefully we can avoid that fate for ourselves. Jacopo twitched his whiskers in what Dantes assumed was an approximation of shrug. We shall see. With those encouraging words, they began moving through the tunnels, chambers, and rooms that made up the outer edges of the pit. Dantes had a solid grasp of everything to expect in them, as had traveled through many of them before. It would take nearly an hour before they reached the edges of kobold territory and would need to slow down. Jacopo kept up easily at first, but began to tire the further they went. At one point, when Dantes was forced to re-evaluate his path when a tunnel had gone through in the past was blocked, Jacopo leapt onto his jacket and settled into a pocket, peeking his head out to continue observing what was happening as they moved. Eventually, Dantes found himself in less familiar territory. He pulled out the thin metal rod and began tapping the floor in front of him, while also keeping a lookout for any areas where the dust and dirt had been disturbed. It didn't take long for him to hear a hollow sound when tapping what appeared to be a broken part of the path ahead. He very gingerly slipped around it and to the other side. Pitfalls were a basic trap, but difficult to set up in the pit. The stone was so hard that digging them out yourself would be nearly impossible. Finding an area that already had a hole and covering it up was another story, of course. You want to keep moving when Jacopo yelled, "Stop!" Dantes froze. Jacopo crawled out from his jacket and onto his shoulder, where he gently tilted his head to show a thin wire suspended directly in front of him. He followed the wire with his eyes and saw that it led to the wall and then to a large stone directly above him. Had he triggered the trap, the rock would have crushed him. He let out a breath and ducked under the wire. The pitfall had seemed a bit obvious. It had been the easily avoidable trap meant to cause someone to drop their guard. Very clever. He kept moving forward, continuing to test the ground with the metal rod, but moving more slowly and patiently overall. He managed to find and gently disarm a shrapnel trap, a spear launcher, and kept Jacopo from wandering into a stick trap that would have rendered him unable to move, taking the piece of moldy bread from the center of it and giving it to him to allow him his prize without a sacrifice. They moved further and further in and began to see signs of the kobolds. Three-toed footprints, shed skins, even some old bones that Dantes were almost certain had belonged to a halfling. Had heard rumors that the kobolds never wanted for meat. He wondered if they actively hunted other races or if this had merely been a scavenging opportunity. He felt that he would have heard if the former was the case. At least that was what he told himself as they continued moving. Eventually, they reached a stone door. In the front of it was an opening for a key. Before he even took out his lockpicks, he and Jacopo scanned the entire area for any possible traps it was linked to, but found nothing. Dantes pulled out his tools and squatted in front of the lock. He got to work, but found that the lock was more complex than had expected. That, coupled with the lack of practice with locks Head had in the last 5 years, led to a number of quiet creative curses as he worked. At one point, he came incredibly close, but lost it at the last moment. There was a tumbler toward the front of the lock that he kept fumbling. He ran a hand up his face and through his hair. "Jacopo?" "Yes." He answered, removing a small crumb from his whisker quickly. "Can you put your hand into this and push right?" He tapped on the tumbler with his pick. "Here?" "Yes." He crawled out from Dante's pocket and into the inside a jacket until he was hanging halfway out of his sleeve. Then he reached out and placed his paw on the tumbler. Dantes went to work around him, and with a click that sounded like music to him, the door was unlocked. He slid it slowly open to see 3 kobolds standing just beyond it, all looking at him with spears raised. He froze and Jacopo fled back into his jacket. He was certain he could take one of them, maybe even two, but not three of them. They were all armed with stone-tipped spears, not to mention teeth and claws. He hadn't realized Head made it far enough into their territory to encounter this many of them. They hadn't stabbed him right away. That was good. Meant he may be able to talk his way out of the situation. Added novel Benedat. All of these thoughts occurred in an instant, and at the end of that instant, the kobolds clapped. The clapping made Dantes jump, but he kept himself from lunging into the nearest of the kobolds in an attempt to take them down before they could take him down. "Good job with the lock," said one of them to his left. His scales were green with flecks of gold, and he spoke at an odd, deliberate pace. "Yes, very impressive for one of the clumsy-handed races," said a different one. He was red with a single silver eye, and he spoke with a bit more confidence. A third, black-scaled kobold wearing a purple robe that had clearly originally been made for an elf or a human, inhaled deeply. "I don't know. I taste a whiff of dwarf on him. Still impressive, though. Dwarven blood could be as much of a liability as it is a benefit. It could mean he attempted the entire journey drunk," said the red one. Rather than laughing at the comment as Dantes would have expected, the other two kobolds simply nodded as if they'd just heard a unique piece of wisdom. Dantes slowly moved his hand off the shiv he had been ready to reach for in his sleeve. He then knelt down and picked up his lockpicks, which had fallen from the door, not taking his eyes off the three in front of him. "Thank you for the compliments. It wasn't easy. We were hoping that you'd get caught so that we could eat well tonight, but since you have made it so far without issue, we can no longer claim your flesh." The red one gestured to himself, then the green kobold, and the black one. "I am Tyr. He is Fun. He is Tech." Dantes nodded at each of them as they were introduced, and when they were done, he pointed to himself. Imtez. Kobolds had a system of names that represented their place in kobold society. The first syllable was for identifying, and the following ones were based on who they were and what they did. Since they were in the pit, no kobold had more than a single syllable since they no longer had their old place in their society. Whenever Dantes had spoken with Mez, a kobold bootlegger he traded with, had always only referred to him as Tez, so he figured he'd stick with that. "Tez, welcome. Come. Tyr moved further in, and Dantes followed him slowly, making sure that the kobolds weren't moving to surround or trick him. He saw a small fire with rats roasting over it on a spit, for piles of loose cloth, and a small table with tools that looked to have been crafted from small pieces of scrap metal or stone. Once they reached the fire, Tyr grabbed one of the skewered rats and handed it to him. Dante's mouth watered. Cooked meat was a rare thing in the pit. It wasn't the first time He'd eaten rat, though it was the first time He'd done so since He'd begun talking to them. He took a sniff, but couldn't detect any poison or anything else suspicious. He took a test bite, and, after a few minutes, took another. A cousin, whispered Jacopo from his collar. He had been warned many times of the dangers of this region. He sniffed. "Give me a piece." Dantes subtly tore off a piece of rat and handed it to Jacopo. Rats could be found all throughout the prison. The areas closest to the maw had the fewest of them. It was a common thing for people to hunt them, but the rats in the pit were different, smarter than their kin in the city. They tended to avoid traps and be long gone before anyone could reach them when they were being hunted. Dantes had only eaten them on those lucky occasions where Head found one in a kobold trap before the kobolds had. After they were all seated and eating, Tech looked at Dantes. "So, what brings you to our territory?" "Just passing through," he said, wary of revealing his intentions, as welcoming as the kobolds were. "Passing through, too?" asked Tyr, insistent. Added novel Benedat. He thought it over. It didn't really matter if they knew. There wasn't anything they could do with the information that could hurt him. They already had him outnumbered if their intention was to harm him. Clan Stonedust territory. Unauthorized reproduction. This story has been taken without approval. Reports sightings. "You are going the wrong way," said Finn simply. "Faster to travel through the maw." "Can't do that." Tyr nodded sagely. "Someone means to kill you?" Dantes nodded, surprised at the insightful question. "Yes." Tech chuckled. "Very common. Some human kills an orc, or a small gang picks a fight they can't win." Soon they can only survive on the outskirts, forced to deal with us. Most don't manage the traps, though. Too stupid, or they break them and ruin our hard work. This is also stupid. Finn picked a rat leg from his teeth. Why did you not simply break the traps? That is what your kind usually does. I have a friend, Mez. He gave me some advice about you that I try to follow. Mez? The one who brews? Asked Tyr. Dantes nodded. Tyr's expression became sour. The one that refuses to live with his clan. His booze is good, though, said Tech. Tyr gave him a look, and Tech shrugged. It is. Even a single sip is guaranteed to thicken your scales. The only thing his brew is good for is disinfecting wounds, said Fun. Though, in his defense, that is a good purpose. Seeing Tyr's expression, Dantes moved to change the subject. So why are you three here? It's our shift to check the traps here. Take any captured meat back to the clan. Guide any kobolds new to the pit to their new home. Why not meet them at the maw? Tech frowned. If they cannot get here, they are not welcome in the clan. Many of these traps, and the door, are here to challenge them. If they fail, ask Dantes. They would still join us, said Tyr. They would be shared among the clan. Dantes nodded, understanding the implication. It wasn't exactly subtle. He finished his rat, picking off the last piece to hand to Jacopo, who chewed on it greedily. The cannibalism didn't bother him much. Jacopo was a rat, which meant he had very different standards, which Dantes saw no point in judging him for. It did make him think of cannibalism from his perspective. If he ate an elf or an orc, would it be full cannibalism or just 1/4 cannibalism? Would eating a human be half cannibalism then? He had a bit of dwarf in him, though the thought of chewing through one's hairy hide was even less appetizing to him than regular cannibalism was. The kobolds clearly had no issues with the practice. Dantes placed his rat skewer back into the fire and stood, brushing some dust from himself and wiping grease from his face with the sleeve of his jacket. Thank you for your hospitality, particularly not killing me. I appreciate that. You are welcome, said Fun with a nod. I'm going to try and make it the rest of the way to Clan Stone Dust territory. The kobolds exchanged glances. Tyr seemed to read the other two's looks and turned his attention to Dantes. Tech will accompany you out of our space. No reason to risk you destroying or triggering one of our traps and giving us more work to do. Dantes narrowed his eyes. I could travel alone. I've had little issue with your traps so far. Or you could just tell me what to expect. They've been friendly to him, and that made him suspicious. It is our territory. You have entered it respectfully and eaten within it. We insist. Dantes mulled that over. If his meeting with the dwarves didn't go well, there was a good chance he'd need to come back through this section of the pit. He couldn't afford to antagonize them. He wouldn't need to rely on Tech for direction, since he had a general sense of which passages to take anyway. And even if the intention was for Tech to kill him, he was fairly certain he could handle a single kobold, particularly one he intended to be watching closely for the entire trek. Okay, but I'm going to be searching for additional traps as we move in case you've forgotten one I might run into, he said. Tyr made a slightly offended expression, but Tech shook his head. It would be insulting if you didn't. They began walking through the tunnels, Tech leading the way as they moved. Even with him guiding them around traps, Dantes still tested the ground with his metal rod and stayed on his guard, as did Jacopo. Still, it began to seem as if his fear was unwarranted. Tech was very careful to take him around the traps, even moving him around those that wouldn't have triggered for him, but would activate for Dantes due to his greater height and weight. Eventually, they reached a large, long hall with high ceilings. Thousands upon thousands of small holes have been carved into the walls, barely the size of a fist. The depth of each hole varied in such a way that it created patterns and images that seemed to shift based on where one was standing. He could sense a few small creatures living within them, unaware of the tapestry they were a part of. By Dantes' estimation, they were very close to Clan Stone Dust territory. Suddenly, he felt Jacopo begin scrambling within his coat and up to his collar. Danger! We must move. Tech stopped in his tracks. Something's wrong. The moment he finished speaking, a massive dark shape dropped down from the ceiling. Tech threw himself away from the shape and rolled as he brought up a spear. The creature stood quickly on its 8 legs and launched itself at Dantes. Dantes dodged narrowly, catching a glimpse of the beast as it launched itself past him. It was the same color as the stone walls, with black spots all across its furry carapace. It was almost the size of Dantes, its fangs the length of daggers, and its 8 eyes reflecting what little light emanated from the glowing fungus on the hallway walls. Before he could fully stand, the spider launched itself at him again, and he rolled away, taking a glancing blow on his arms from one of its gangly legs. He drew the shiv from his boot and ducked behind the cover of a fallen piece of stone before the monster could leap at him again. Tech raised a spear and stabbed out at the spider with its stone tip. He managed a glancing blow on its legs, causing it to spew green ichor, but before he could follow up, the spider leapt again onto a wall and scuttled away into the thicker darkness toward the ceiling. Dantes stayed put. The ceiling must have been very high for him to lose sight of the monster, even with his ability to see in the dark. He searched the edges of his vision while trying to see if he could hear the spider's movements, but creatures like it tended to walk far too softly to be heard. He was immediately reminded of the footfalls of the elves that had been hunting him. He tried extending his perceptions that had allowed him to sense rats and other creatures as well, but while he could sense many creatures, the spider itself was undetectable to him. Tech was doing much the same, keeping his spear pointed upward in expectation of the spider jumping for him, and searching with all of his senses for any indication of where it might strike from. Jacopo crawled out from Dante's jacket and into a narrow crevice in the rock he was hidden behind. "I'm too small a meal for him. I may accidentally be crushed or skewered in your jacket, though." Dantes nodded. He wouldn't want to take that risk either in Jacopo's place. He kept searching, each second feeling like an hour as he looked and listened. He could feel that the mold around him was content. It was dark and wet in this portion of the pit, and it had been able to spread happily, only ever fearing competition from other molds that attempted to grow into it. Except one patch, up and slightly behind where Tech was annoyed, bothered by something. "Tech, behind you." The kobold ducked and spun just as the jumping spider hurled itself at him from that patch of mold. He managed a deep cut into the creature's abdomen before it landed. The monster stumbled, and Dantes took the chance to leap from his cover and drive his shiv deep into its thick carapace, breaking off the tip of it before backing away and drawing another from his sleeve. The creature stumbled more and fell, landing somehow upside down with its legs kicking the air. Tech avoided the legs and drove his spear one last time into the creature. It spasmed once, then its legs slowly curling inward, and it ceased moving. This narrative has been purloined without the author's approval. Report any appearances on Amazon. Dantes could feel its death somehow. He sensed the life within it leaving the corpse that remained. He wondered for a moment why he hadn't been able to sense anything about it before its death. He hadn't encountered a jumping spider before. Perhaps that was a reason? He needed some affinity with a creature and its kind in order to sense or understand it. If he had met more spiders in the past, would he have been able to speak to it? It is rare for other races to have eyes better than a kobold's in the dark. Saw a glint off its eyes in the corner. "Just got lucky, I suppose," he lied. "Your luck was mine, too. Thank you." Dantes frowned and looked at the spider's corpse. He knelt down and carefully pried each of its fangs out before sawing them off with his shiv. He could see small globules of clear venom dripping from them. He carefully placed them in a thicker leather pocket he had in his coat for anything sharp or dangerous, which the fangs were well qualified for. Once he was done, he looked at the corpse again, and then at a nearby patch of mold in the corner. He grabbed one of the spider's legs and began dragging it. It wasn't as heavy as he expected. He placed the body carefully in the corner and felt the gratitude of the mold for a fresh meal to decompose. "One good turn deserves another," he muttered quietly. Once he was done, he felt Jacopo crawl back up through his pant leg and into his jacket. The sensation was an unpleasant one and made him shiver. Tech looked at him questioningly. "Spiders. Can't stand them. Other races are often cowards," he said, nodding sagely. "Why did you move it?" "Don't want to see it if I have to come back through here." The kobold scrunched his face up as he had an internal debate. "The dwarves' traps begin after this hall." Dantes raised an eyebrow. "Where after this hall?" In the exit archway. Dantes looked, seeing nothing, but he believed him. We were getting pretty close to it. When were you planning on telling me? I wasn't. Dantes nodded slowly, understanding. You felt obligated to help me through your traps, but not the dwarves. Tech didn't answer. And when I triggered one of them and died, you would be able to take me back and feed your clan some fresh meat. You understand our people well. Dantes squeezed his hand into a fist. He understood, but it still pissed him off. That said, he still needed to stay in the kobold's good graces, and now that had seen Tech use a spear, he was a bit less confident in his ability to take him out on his own. It didn't make sense to do anything about it, at least not at that moment. Why won't he now? Oh, you may have died in that fight without you. True, so will you guide me through the rest of the traps? He shook his head. I will tell you of them, but we recently caught a young dwarf in a pitfall, Iron in the Mine's nephew. Clan Stonedust has not been pleased with us because of that, since we refused to pay their blood price. Dantes nodded. Dwarves could be picky like that. Had heard many stories of entire gangs, or even clans being wiped out because of a refusal to give up on a blood price. The fact that they haven't engaged in open warfare mean that the nephew likely wasn't a favorite of Iron's, and so he was just going through the motions. Okay, what can I expect? Tech described a series of falling axes, a hammer meant to hit tall folk in the knees, a pit filled with ratcha, the giant roaches that infested some areas of the pit, and finally a sling that would fire a series of stones if triggered by a pressure plate near the lead-up to the dwarves' entrance. Once he was done, they parted ways. Dantes continued down the tunnel, using his rod to detect traps, and moving cautiously even after Tech's warnings. Whether or not Head told him the truth didn't matter. He didn't trust him, nor did he assume that the dwarves wouldn't have switched up their traps between their territories once a blood price had been called between them and the kobolds. In the end, he found all the traps exactly as Tech had described, along with two that he hadn't. The entry to dwarven territory was unlike any other area in the pit. It looked new, with smooth stone, carved floors, and simple braziers powered by fertilizer lighting the path. In spite of how difficult the stone within the pit was to work, they'd somehow managed to match the feel of a true dwarven stronghold. Even the awful smell was the same. Dantes had only ever been in one to smuggle dust and help a friend in his efforts to seduce a dwarven noble, and he was impressed by how close this prison recreation was to the real thing. Had it novel been at? He put away his rod and began walking directly down the middle of the path. It felt odd not to be skulking about, but he wanted to be seen. For once He'd have to enter through a front door. Dantes didn't have to walk much further to reach the first dwarf. He was short and stocky, which was unsurprising, with a shaved head and a long braided beard full of decorations of bone and carved stone. A large stone hammer was leaned against the wall next to him as he observed the hall with a calm sturdiness. He noticed Dantes as he approached, and casually lifted the hammer off the wall to hold it in his hands. "The hell's are you doing here, Mutt?" he asked, sounding almost bored in spite of his aggressive words and posture. "Looking to make a deal. Want to meet with Iron. What are you looking to get from him?" "Protection." The dwarf looked Dantes up and down. "You're not nearly pretty enough for him to take that deal." Dantes shook his head. "I wouldn't travel all the way through kobold territory to be his bitch. Got some information. A way to hurt the Elflin kings." He wanted to play things close to the chest. If he could get all the way to Iron without revealing exactly what he had to trade, it could only benefit him. The dwarf tested the weight of the hammer's head in his hand. "Why don't you tell me the information, and I'll see if it's worth bringing up." "No, my offer is for Iron in the Mine, no one else." "What if I just break your arms and legs until you tell me what you know? That way I get it for free." Dantes laughed. "I can't stand pain. It'll pass out the moment you start, and you'll never get anything out of me anyway." He scoffed and went from testing the weight of his hammer to stroking his beard. "I'm getting bored sitting down here, smashing the occasional spider anyway. Fuck it, come with me." He turned around and put a small carving into an impression in the wall and turned it. The stone doors slowly opened, and he gestured for Dantes to walk in front of him. Dantes complied, and they began moving through the dwarven hall. The dwarves were probably the race best suited to life in the pit, aside perhaps from the kobolds. They were used to living underground, preferred it even. Now they still missed easy access to women, booze, and food. Not to mention the complaints Head heard from every dwarf Head ever spoken to about the geography, hardness of the stone, and their lack of easy access to metal to shape it. While Dantes had been impressed with how the dwarves had shaped their territory, now that he was actually walking through it, the space felt cramped. The walls seemed tighter, and the ceilings even lower than in the other dwarven hall had been in the city. He also noticed that while the hall had been through before in the city had almost no seams on the walls. These, on the other hand, seemed to be layered with evenly sized bricks. It clicked with Dantes that rather than carving the walls to make things better suit them, they'd instead taken stone from elsewhere and carved it into bricks to create rooms and halls within a space that had already existed. With their limited resources, that was the only way they could have done it. This realization distracted him as he was escorted through a half-dozen halls and into a room with a large stone table in the center. The table wasn't full. Only around a dozen dwarves were sitting at it, chatting and drinking. 2 were wrestling shirtless near the table in a circle of sand, and 5 more were watching the fight, cheering on whichever of them they'd wagered on. Presiding over it all on a wooden throne, a true luxury in the pit, was Iron from the mine. He was broad, even for a dwarf, and his dark hair was braided with gold and silver rings, in sharp contrast to the copper and bone of the dwarves around him. On his waist was somehow a gun, some kind of blunderbuss, Dantes would guess. He hadn't seen many of their kind. They'd been relatively new even before had been thrown into the pit, but to see one in the pit truly surprised him. This narrative has been purloined without the author's approval. Report any appearances on Amazon. At novel been at. Dantes had only ever seen Iron from a distance in the past. It hadn't been prudent to be noticed by him then, but up close he could understand the appeal of having a man like him in charge. Iron practically radiated authority. The dwarf that had been escorting Dantes stepped forward toward Iron and slapped his hammer against a bangle on his arm, creating a surprisingly delicate tone that drew the room's attention to them. He nodded to Iron. Iron, this one approached us from Kobold territory. He says he has information for us regarding the elves, though I believe he may have something different in mind. He asks us for protection. Dwarven eyes moved toward Dantes, sizing him up. He didn't shrink under their stares. Dwarves were shrewd negotiators and harsh judges of character. Showing weakness could sometimes be beneficial when you wanted something from them. But in this case, he needed to radiate confidence to demonstrate that what he had on offer had value. Iron took a long swig from the clay mug that sat in his hand and gestured for Dantes to approach. All right, I was getting bored of watching these short-bearded shits try to stay entertained anyway. Go ahead, Mutt, what's your offer? Dantes reached into one of the hidden pouches in his jacket and pulled out the mirror. This is my offer. One of the elves' magic mirrors and how to use it. You can have it, and my knowledge, in return for you and your men's protection. Iron whistled. Now, that is an entertaining fucking surprise. He stood up from his throne and walked toward Dantes. Once he was close to the mirror, he nodded. Yes, it's got the shimmers around it. That's true magic right there. He laughed. So you're the one that managed to steal it from them. How'd you do it? Bribe someone? Wear disguise? Cut throats until you reached it? Scratch that last one. Someone who could do that wouldn't need my protection. He took a step closer, but Dantes stood his ground, standing 2 heads taller than the dwarf. One of the others spoke up. Hey, is he the same mutt that the kings have been looking for? Iron smirked. That's a good question. Are you some kind of genius who decided Head just double down on pissing them off, or what? Something like that. Iron laughed, and the rest of the room joined in. Then he stopped suddenly, and the rest of the room did its best to stop with him, one of them getting a firm smack to the back of his head when he kept laughing a little too long. So you give me that mirror and tell me how to use it. And then what? I can pretend I'm an elf to get them to smuggle me pithy little materials until they get wise, and then the mirror's useless. Or I can put the tip of this. He pulled his blunderbuss from his belt and pointed it at Dantes, threw it, and pulled the trigger for a laugh. Dantes stayed quiet and still with the gun's barrel in his face. Normally in life or death situations, he had a number of ways to survive pop into his head. In this particular case, he was drawing a blank, but force himself to talk anyway. Appearing weak would do him no favors. The possibilities are endless. Iron chuckled and lowered his pistol, though he didn't holster it. It isn't a bad offer. We don't often miss an opportunity to fuck with the kings. Anything to shut up their comments about height and the weaknesses of having a beard. He sneered. Unfortunately for you, we made peace with their Grand Duke just yesterday. He swung his blunderbuss with more speed than Dantes thought he'd have at his disposal, and struck the mirror, shattering it into a dozen small pieces. He followed that up with a fist to his gut, causing him to hunch over and fall to his knees. Dantes gritted his teeth and carefully picked up the pieces of the mirror while he was pretending to recover, slipping them into his pockets. As he picked up the last of the visible shards and slipped it away, Iron drove his foot into his side. His vision went white with pain, but it wasn't just his own. Jacopo had been sitting in his jacket exactly where the dwarf's foot had struck. Dantes adjusted his position so that Jacopo wouldn't be in any danger from the next several strikes that hit him. Now, said Iron, I'm still not the biggest fan of the kings, and I appreciate the balls it took you to get this far. So I'll tell you what, I want to hand you off to them, but I'll have my men drop you in the maw. He climbed back up to his throne and sat down. I do wish you luck, but honestly, I don't care if a mutt like you lives or dies. Two dwarves dragged Dantes through their halls and out to the entrance of their territory by the maw, then tossed him out. He was battered, bruised, and his plan was in tatters. He made a fist, feeling the sand at the entrance to the pit slide through his fingers. It was familiar. The only difference between being thrown into the maw this time and the last time was that this time didn't also come with the sting of betrayal. He stood and looked around. A few scrawny-looking dwarves, untouchable's head guess, were already beginning to look at him and size him up. If he stayed there long enough, they'd develop enough of a spine to make a move on him. He drew his hood up to hide his face and started stumbling toward the nearest tunnel that he remembered would lead him back to his cave. Jacopo, are you all right? He asked quietly. Jacopo didn't respond. Dantes could feel the rat's pain, and his life force slowly flowing out of him like a slow breeze. He began making his way to the same tunnel in which had stolen the supply drop with a quick blow from a sturdy rock. He did his best not to draw attention to himself as he moved. This was the busiest portion of the pit, and that was both a blessing and a curse for a man trying to keep himself hidden. He managed to not attract any trouble until he got closer to the undermarket. It was there that he saw three elfland kings moving toward him, heads held high and haughtily looking down their noses at everyone around them. He stumbled to a nearby wall and stuck a finger down his throat, forcing himself to vomit. Maybe if his whore of a mother had fucked a dwarf instead, he could have held onto his liquor, joked one of them. The others laughed, and Dantes managed to continue on his path unimpeded for a bit longer, playing the part of a drunken fool for several more stumbling steps. Unfortunately, not long after the first group of elves had moved on, he realized they were simply the vanguard for a larger group, and leading them was Riavere, their Grand Duke of Spring, still shirtless and covered in tattoos of trees and elvish script. Dantes cursed under his breath and diverted his course sharply, disguising it as a near fall as he moved toward the entry to the undermarket. He made it past the consortium guards without issue. Once he began weaving through back alleys, dropping his drunken act in favor of speed. He encountered a drunken half-orc pissing in an alley between vendor stalls. The orc's eyes widened as they made eye contact. Hey, ain't you the one those elves are dash? Dantes drove his knee into the orc's groin, causing him to crumple, and then quickly moved down another alley with a fresh piss stain on his pants. He started to hear some commotion behind him, and even in front of him, as if he was being cut off. He cursed under his breath and made his way to the witch wench. The front wasn't being managed by Sin, but Celeste, in the guise of a busta halfling, who he didn't know as well and didn't trust, flanked by a dead-eyed orc and dwarf. He went around the building to Sin's corner of it and knocked on the wall. I told you earlier, Tell, the first time was a special rate for a friend. Today's my day off anyway, and no, that doesn't mean I'm free for. A kobold woman unlatched and looked through a small window. Her slitted eyes dilated when she realized it was Dantes. It was difficult for him to trust her to help him, but he couldn't see any other choice. She looked around to make sure no one could see them, then became an Orcish woman and held out her hands. Dantes took them, and she hauled him into the room where he landed with a thud. "Why are you here, Two Names? The kings have been searching for you. This is the last place you should be right now. Dwarves dumped me here when I tried, making a trade for protection. Trying to make it into the outer tunnels, but some asshole spotted me in an alley." Dantes looked around the room as he spoke. Had never been in Sin's room. They tended to do their gambling and talking at the nearby bar, or even in collared territory. There was a real bed stuffed with straw, curtains nailed to the walls to hide the shoddy craftsmanship of the building, a large bowl filled with water, next to which were several rags, and even some soap. Next to the bed was a shelf on which were several bottles, the purpose of which was not difficult to determine. The entire room smelled like roses. Likely a strong perfume had been sprayed to hide more unpleasant scents, though Dantes could pick up the smell hiding underneath. It reminded him of his mother and the rune shed used when she was working. This tale has been pilfered from Royal Road. If found on Amazon, kindly file a report. Sin looked him over. "You're hurt. Sit on the bed for a bit. Lie down if you have to, but watch that stain on the left." Sin moved over to a pitcher of water and began pouring a cup. Dantes went and sat on the edge of the bed, opening his jacket to check on Jacopo again. Jacopo was unconscious, but breathing, a small amount of blood trickling out of the edge of his mouth. Dantes clenched his jaw, feeling his small tusks prick the inside of his cheeks, as they so often did. He could feel the life draining slowly from him. He thought back to the seeds Head planted before Head gone into the kobold's region of the pit. The offering Head given, almost instinctively, to help them grow. He brought his finger to one of his tusks, pricked it, and let a single drop of blood drop into Jacopo's mouth. It was subtle, but he thought he could feel the leaking of life force slow down the moment the droplet hit his mouth. Sin handed him a cup. "Here." Dantes nodded and took a long drink. He hadn't had any water at all that day, and the taste of vomit from earlier was still strong in his mouth. He swallowed and clenched his jaw again. All that work for nothing. All he had now was a pocket full of broken mirror, fresh bruises, and the bitter taste of failure in his mouth. His new abilities were helpful, but they weren't enough. He needed more. He touched the pocket that held the mirror shard there, still may be a use for them. He started to think on it, gently running his thumb across a flat surface. There was a sudden commotion from the brothel's entrance. He and Sin exchanged a glance, and they both moved to the door to press their ears against the door. Looking for a mutt. Short, wearing a big jacket. Gold eyes. Head shape that indicates low cunning and a preference for men. Slight ear point that shows a weakness for spirits. Ran in this direction. "There's no one here by that description. We'll check ourselves, thank you." There was a brief scuffle with the no-name guards, and from there was the sound of doors being knocked at, or knocked down as the searchers went room by room. They could hear the sounds of men cursing as they were interrupted, followed by short beatings and room searches. Just before they reached Sin's room, she opened her mouth and let out a guttural moan, followed by a series of other noises that would have made any man who hadn't been raised in a brothel blush. In Dantes' case, it only made him look over at her with curiosity. She kept up the performance as the commotion got closer and began adding male grunts and groans to the chorus, making it seem as if she was two people at once, sometimes even speaking with both voices simultaneously. Just before there was a knock on the door, Sin added additional layers to her performance with some dialogue. "I didn't even know a gnome could be that big," followed by additional lewd noises. "Big things come in small packages." She replied to herself. The search stopped, and there was some shuffling of feet. "I don't want to see what's going on in there. Sounds like a gnome in there anyway. Dantes must made his way around us, or that half-breed orc lied. Let's go." One set of footsteps began walking away, but the other one hesitated, and Dantes heard him place his own head against the door for a few moments. "Huh, good for him," the elf muttered, before following his companion out the door. Even after they left, Sin kept up the performance for another 10 minutes, adding more dialogue, backstory, and plot as she went along even after Dantes had given her the all-clear. When she finally finished the ruse with a spectacular climax, She was breathing heavily and sat heavily on the bed, gesturing for Dantes to pour her some water. Dantes did so, looking at her with his eyebrow raised as she took the cup. I got wrapped up in the story. I wanted to see it through. Fair enough, he said, sitting back down on the edge of the bed. Looking at her, he got another flicker of the milk-white skin and large black eyes hidden behind the Orcish female form she was still in from lifting him through the window. He ignored his discomfort of the sight. Thank you, Sin. I appreciate it. She shrugged. If it was anyone else, it'd forced a pact from them, but with you, that's pointless. Still, you owe me. I do. Unfortunately, you'll have to rely on my honor to pay you back. That, I could have a few. Dantes stayed in Sin's room for a few more hours, waiting for the coast to clear. He may have failed with his plan, but he was alive, and that meant he still had options. Jacopo's condition remained unchanged. Dantes could no longer feel his life force slipping out, but he also didn't seem to be improving. Dantes counted the pieces of broken mirror. There were 13 shards. He could no longer use them to bargain or to acquire resources for himself, but there was still one option left with them. Had tried working within the systems of the Underprison to find a way out of his predicament. Since that didn't work, it really left him only one choice. He'd need to upend them. He could no longer keep his head down. He didn't want to struggle to survive. If he was trapped in the pit, he wanted to rule it. If it didn't work out, he'd be dead, but that was the path he was on anyway. Sin gently shook him. His eyes had been closed while he was thinking, and he had dozed off without meaning to. Dantes, this is the quietest time in the Undermarket. Now is the time to leave. At it, novel been at. He nodded and sat up. Head tried to sleep on Sin's bed, but had wound up sleeping on the floor when the softness of it had proven oddly uncomfortable for him. He wiped the sleep from his eyes and stood. Sin was in the shape of an old woman wearing a shawl and leaning on a walking stick. Never seen you in a form like that. She shrugged. It's nice to change things up every once in a while. It gets tiring spending most of my time not being able to see my toes past my chest or not being able to take a form over 20 years old. Though I have a few customers who have more unique preferences, they come with their own issues, though. Any chance I could pay for information on those customers? Could always use some blackmail material. She shook her head. Can't tell you. I'm bound by the client pact. Dantes shrugged. Shame. He drew his jacket closer and pulled up his hood as he walked over to the window Shed pulled him through several hours earlier. He looked back at her, seeing that she was now a homely woman of around 40 years, with small features and a long nose. Thanks again, Sin. I will remember this. She nodded. If you live, come back and do some gambling with us when you get this solved. If. She shook her head, her eyes turning the same shade of gold as Dantes. You'll either die or have more than just 2 names by the end of this. My bet is on the latter. Dantes frowned, unsure of how to respond. He slipped gracefully out of the window, wincing as he landed, and the bruises from the previous day's beating pulsed painfully. He moved up along the wall and looked around the Undermarket. Sin was right. It was dead. He noticed only a few drunks sleeping on the ground, and a single corpse riddled with stab wounds in a dark alley as he wove his way toward the exit. In spite of the fact that the sun wasn't a constant thing in the pit, everyone still seemed to be most active during the day and less active at night. The habits of their old lives shaping patterns in their new ones. Stolen from its original source, this story is not meant to be on Amazon. Report any sightings. Dantes made it to the exit without issue and walked past the sleepy dwarven guards who didn't bother to acknowledge him. The consortium didn't involve themselves in other gangs' issues. It was bad for business, and neutrality tended to pay much larger dividends. Once he was out of the Undermarket and into the larger network of tunnels, he could breathe more easily. He took side tunnels, small passages he needed to crawl under, and even routes covered in cobwebs and crawling with roaches and other small vermin to avoid running into any other prisoners. He could swear he could hear the voices of the vermin speaking faintly as he moved, but when he stopped and paid attention, the voices faded. Eventually, he made it back to his cave. He reached gently into his pocket for Jacopo and held him in his hands. He was still alive, and his breathing seemed to be steadier than it had been. Dantes laid him down on his bed of rags, gently placing one of them over him like a blanket. Once he was done, he watered his plants and fed his mushrooms, all of which seemed to have grown yet another several inches outward while had been gone. There were even a number of small tufts of green and red plants beginning to crop up in other areas of the cave, all of which he took a moment to water. When he reached his senses out to them, he could sense a kind of excitement, a freshness that came with new life. Once he was done, he ate a small meal and took the pieces of broken mirror out of his jacket and carefully arranged them on a long flat stone. He needed to perform a test. He grabbed the 13th shard and stood carefully transferring it between his fingers as if it was a coin. He made his way out of his cavern, grabbing his long metal pole on the way, and went to the cavernous room in which Head planted the fruit seeds earlier that day. Inside the room, he found that every single one of the seeds had sprouted. The peach pit Jacopo had asked him to plant had somehow already grown into a sapling that reached his knees. The berry seeds had sprouted into a number of ankle-height bushes, and the grapes had spread across the ground as vines. Instead of being green, all of the plant's leaves were a dull red color. When he reached out to them, he could feel strength and vitality radiating off of them, as well as gratitude for his blood along with a hunger for more. He obliged them, pricking his thumb again and giving each of the growing plants a single droplet. He could feel energy moving from him to the plants, but also some of the plants' energy shifting to him, as if the strength was being shared rather than given. The gears of his mind began turning as he looked across the spreading red leaves, but he filed those ideas and plans away for another time. He went deeper into the room, far from his freshly growing garden, and placed the shard of mirror gently on a piece of fallen wall. He stepped away and crouched behind a fallen piece of masonry. He took his still bleeding finger and squeezed several drops of blood onto the tip of his metal rod. Then he gently held it over the piece of mirror, trying to minimize his profile as much as possible. He held his breath as a single drop of his blood dripped from the tip of his staff down onto the mirror, and he yanked the rod backward. Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then the mirror began to glow red. Dantes ducked down just as it exploded, the noise of it deafening him as small chunks of debris flew over his head. When he peeked out, he could see black marks where the explosion had hit the ground and walls, and a small crater where the mirror shard had been. Dantes smiled. This was something he could work with. All he needed was a delivery system and some information. The delivery system relied on Jacopo getting better, and the information he was certain he could dig up for a price. He took a bit more time to check on the plants, then returned to his cave, careful to move as quietly and carefully through even the short distance of tunnels between his new garden and his cave. Had just made a lot of noise, and while he doubted the elves had sent anyone this far into the pit, there was no telling what else it might attract. Once he was back in his cave, he immediately checked on Jacopo. His breathing seemed steadier, and Dantes could feel the core of life within him starting to strengthen. He sighed. He'd need Jacopo's help from here on, so he was stuck until he recovered. He lay down on the floor next to his bed, dragging a few of the rags closer to himself so that he could rest his head on them without disturbing his companion, and close his eyes. Even with the nap head taken its sins, he was exhausted, and, after only a few deep breaths, he fell asleep. It was dark and cramped. Dantes could feel earth pressing down on him from all sides, but he felt oddly calm. The dark and confining space felt natural and comforting. Dantes moved through it, wriggling through the dirt and rock as naturally as Head walked through a hallway, feeling pulled toward a destination. The tunnel he was in opened up into a larger chamber, and he stood up, though doing so felt oddly unnatural. In front of him was a strange gray wool spinning in midair. At least that's what he thought it was until he looked closer. It was rats, a writhing mass of them all moving in circles over and over again, linked by long tails that were all knotted in the center in a tangle, which he could not see the beginning or the end of. The mass turned its attention to him as he approached, feeling drawn to it. Dantes. The voice was both one and many all talking at once, and it struck him with a kind of force that made him stumble onto his back foot. He squared his stance and forced himself to take another step forward. Who are you? Where am I? The mass moved toward him, expanding and contracting as the individual rats that made it up scampered and writhed across one another. I'm a god of rats. This is my domain. A god of rats? Had never heard of such a thing. Had offered prayers to the god of thieves and avoided the god of greed. His mother had made the occasional offering to the goddess of hidden women, and one of her clients had been a priest to the god of temperance, though he only visited once a year. Had heard of more than 100 gods, and was certain there were thousands Had never heard of, but they were all gods of the races that could walk and speak, not of creatures that lived and died based on instinct. Still, he could feel the power radiating from the being in front of him. The primal force of it left him little reason to doubt the creature's claim. What do you want of me? The god's body began moving more slowly, its individual rats seeming to be pensive, searching for something. It is not common for one of your kind to bind yourself to one of my children. They usually avoid us, think of us a part of their natural order, but without honoring us or acknowledging our importance. They choose pacts with the bear, elk, shark, lion, or wolf. The god of wolves has been witness to more bindings than the god of roaches has children. The god's tone was spiteful as it spoke, some parts of its form actually hissing as it said the word wolf. My kind? Druids. Dantes frowned. Had never heard the word before, but was grateful to have some indication of what was happening to him. It would help him to figure out what was happening to him once he solved his more immediate life or death problems. I have brought you here to give you my blessing, and to complete your binding to Jacopo. The god seemed to chew on the name a bit as he said it. Finish the binding. How did I start it? The offering of your blood to save his life. That is the first step to the binding. Does that mean I'm bound to the plants I gave blood to as well? I do not know. I am not their god. They are the domain of our mother. Dantes put a pin in that for the moment. He wasn't one for dogma, so much as immediate results. The blessing, what does it do? You will be able to call on my people as you need, to see through the eyes of those within my brood, and compel them to do your will. This compulsion is dependent on me and how I feel you have treated them. This narrative has been purloined without the author's approval. Report any appearances on Amazon. How will I know? The blessing will make it clear. And the binding? Jacopo and you shall be joined at the soul. Your growth shall be his, and his growth shall be yours. Dante's mind reeled at the possibilities. Rats were everywhere. He could see the unseen, steal almost anything at will, not to mention send a swarm of rats at his foes to tear them apart, though he intuited that the last option would be heavily dependent on their god's feelings on the matter. Jacopo being bound to him that he was more wary of, but he had a distinct feeling it was too late, and the blessing was likely also dependent on the binding as well. I accept. Every single one of the individual rats began to laugh, a sound that rats did not make normally, and which sent a shiver up Dante's spine. You thought you had a choice? The mass of rats surged toward him and hit him in a wave of flesh and fur. He could feel the raw power of a god wash over him, followed by a burning pain on his wrist. Dantes woke screaming, his own voice echoing back to him as his cry hit the walls of the cave and bounced back to him. He clutched his wrist, his hand contorted into a claw as the burning sensation slowly began to fade. Where he clasped, he felt raised flesh, and when he regained enough presence of mind to look at it, he saw 4 marks on his wrist, 2 on one side and 2 on another. Had slept in enough alleyways to recognize a rat bite when he saw one, though these particular teeth would have had to come from one the size of a dog. 3 of the marks were black, and reminded him of the tattoos common among sailors and Orcish gangs. One of them was gold, and he understood instinctually that the mark represented the favor of the god of rats. He clenched his fist and stood. When he turned to check on Jacopo, he saw a pair of golden eyes that matched his own, looking back at him. He could sense that Jacopo had not just healed, but seemed stronger than ever, the core of his life force pulsing with energy. You're better. Jacopo nodded, this time much more naturally, as if he was much more used to the gesture than he had been the last time Dantes had watched him attempt it. I am. Thanks to you. Dantes shrugged. Needed your help, couldn't have you dying. Jacopo shrugged. Either way, you saved my life and your goals are now mine. At it novel been at. So since our goals are aligned, Do I still need to feed you to keep you from chewing on my feet while I sleep? Yes. Thought so. Dantes looked at the tattoo marks on his arm again. Come with me. Jacopo nodded and leapt onto his leg, crawling up through his jacket and into an interior pocket. They moved out of the cave and through the tunnels into the budding garden. Each of the plants had grown nearly a foot, and a few of them were already starting to bear small amounts of fruit. Dantes went over to the peach tree, the one that had planted after Jacopo had asked him to. Jacopo, this tree and anything it produces, it's yours. Offer it to whoever you want. Keep it to yourself. It's up to you. Jacopo crawled out of the jacket. Dantes could feel it as Jacopo's paws left the warmth of his jacket and landed on a piece of cold stone. He focused for just a moment, and he could suddenly see through Jacopo's eyes. Jacopo's vision and his own existed simultaneously for a jarring moment, and he dismissed it. That would take some practice to do without his eyes closed. Jacopo sniffed around the growing sapling and took a moment to chew on one of its leaves. I will tell them. I also need some of them to help me with a favor. Can you bring, let's say, 20? Dantes thought for a moment. Actually, wait. He looked at the mark on his arm and reached out with that strange ability had developed to sense life. The first thing he noticed was that the plants wanted more blood, but otherwise were strong and thriving. Next, he felt the skittering of all the rats nearby. Come. He gave the order wordlessly, and suddenly 3 dozen rats poured into the cavern from all around him and Jacopo. They all gathered, then sat there silently, some of their heads cocking curiously, and others looking at the unripe fruits that had begun to grow with undisguised hunger. He looked down at the rat mark and noticed a small sliver of black in the gold mark. This was something Dantes looked over the rats arranged before him. They ranged from black to white, with a few having the same brown coloration as Jacopo. Some were large and well-fed, others slim and starved. All of them primarily focused on him aside from a few glances around the cavern. He focused on a corner of the chamber. Move. They obliged, all scrambling there without a second thought, moving over one another like a shifting pool of liquid fur. He checked the mark on his arm again, and while the black line had widened, it was still slimmer than a fingernail. He experimented a bit more, dividing the rats into separate groups, having some of them harvest the fruit from the trees that were ready to be eaten, while he had the rest attack a nest of roaches he'd noticed on his way into his budding plant nursery. As he did this, he watched how each action impacted the gold mark on his wrist. The less complicated actions, single-word orders to move, had little impact, while complex requests cost more. Even having the rats attack something cost him little, unless he ordered them to do it in a specific way. When he was done experimenting, he still had 3/4 of his mark filled with gold. He pointed to the pile of fruit and roach corpses that the rats had put into a pile for him. That's for you. The rats, freed from his control when he made the gesture, tore into the pile of food with gusto, and Dantes watched as the gold mark refilled ever so slightly. He looked at Jacopo, who was perched on a rock next to him. Could you go and get one of the mirror shards out of our cave for me? Where our Jacopo cut off for a moment, and Dantes could feel the connection between them quiver for a moment. Never mind. He hopped off of the rock and scurried away. While he was gone, Dantes pricked a finger on one of his tusks and squeezed a drop of blood onto the root bed of each of his plants, noticing as he did so that the roots were starting to break through the stone that surrounded them, causing it to crumble even more than it had already. When he was done, he could feel the plant's satisfaction, as well as the rats who, after eating, had begun scurrying around the room, some of them leaving, some copulating, and a few climbing into the blood-red leaves to have a nap with a full stomach. Jacopo came back with a single mirror shard. He took it from him and frowned. I'm going to need to cut you with this. What? Add it novel Benedette. I need to make sure that rat blood works on it too, or doesn't work, I suppose, depending on how you define work in this case. The rest of your meat. What? He'll do it for the rest of your meat. Your God told me we were bound at the soul, and you're still going to extort me? I just promised you all the fruit that tree will produce. No fruit yet. He'll just make one of the other rats do it. HRM, 1 piece of meat. Fine. Dantes nodded and looked for a sparse corner. The rest of you need to stay clear while I do this. He yelled at the remaining rats, who scurried into further dark corners. He squatted above Jacopo, pricking his flank with a glass shard. He waited for a drop to hit it, and once it did, it immediately began to glow red. He stood and threw the shard before ducking down, covering Jacopo beneath him. There was an explosion, and some pieces of stone and dirt peppered him. When it was done, he stood up and looked at the destruction. It was the same, if not larger, than the explosion that had occurred when Head used his own blood. With 11 left, he should have plenty of firepower to take care of at least one of his problems. After that, he could start a build. The narrative has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the infringement. His gears turned as he stood and brushed himself off. He could try to get the rats to deliver the mirror shards directly. Simply drop them bloody on top of the elf leadership while they were sleeping. With them gone, Head have some cover and be able to turn his attention to things beyond survival. That didn't feel like enough, though. He wanted them to know it was him. He wanted everyone to know not to fuck with him. And that meant facing them directly. Well, directly was a strong word. Close enough that they knew it was him, and the rest of the pit would too. He went back to his cave, Jacopo in his jacket, and took a moment to care for his plants before he turned right back around and left. He began taking the winding path through the passages, still testing his new abilities as he did so. He noticed that the gold hadn't faded at all when Jacopo had bled for him, which meant that whatever happened between them didn't count beyond the bounds of their own relationship. He also reached out to feel the rats in the walls, along with which he detected the various roaches, molds, and fungi that thrived within the pit. The rats burned brighter now, more clearly. He could feel their thoughts and feelings more easily, and also had an innate sense that he could summon them toward himself at will. He wondered if he would be able to develop that ability with other animals as well. Rats were the creatures he most often encountered, but being able to control roaches or cats, or the wild dogs that roamed the alleys above, or even the slimes that occasionally bubbled out of the sewers. Could he curry their favor as well? Meet their gods and receive their blessing? He sent his attention out to 5 of them and gave them simple orders, asking them to go to the Undermarket and King territory. As they diverted themselves from their previous destinations, he imagined in his mind a line between himself and them. He kept his focus on that line as they got further away from him, and with a small effort, he was able to switch his attention between them, get a general impression of them and where they were, and see what they saw. It was disorienting, so he just focused on maintaining the line. He would put his full attention back on them once he was certain they were where he wanted them. He reached his destination, the entrance to the collard's piece of the pit. The guard that day was Wayne. Wayne's eyes widened as he saw him. "Dantes, what are you doing here? You should have found the deepest hole you could and buried yourself in it. Riavare already had it in for you, and then you steal one of their mirrors and try to sell it to the dwarves?" He shook his head. "I don't think now is the time to have a little visit and gamble. I appreciate the warning, but I'm not just here to gamble. I need to meet with Merle." "Merle? Listen, man, he can't help you. You know the collard can't afford to protect someone against the kings. I'm not looking for protection." He sighed. "I've given up. I'm out of options. I can't buy protection. They won't stop looking for me. I want Merle to contact them for me. Let them know I'll turn myself in if they grant me a quick death." Wayne's expression dropped, and one of his eyebrows raised. "Really?" Dantes nodded. They'd gambled together many times, and he was certain that Wayne couldn't tell that he was lying. Wayne sighed. "Okay, they'll take you to him. Come on." He gestured with his head for Dantes to follow. Dantes knew where Merle was, of course, but there was a process, a ritual to this kind of thing. Merle lived in the largest of the cells in Collard territory, as was his right as their leader. He had held that position for a long time. In fact, as Dantes had been told, had been the one who banded the Collard together in the first place, more than 50 years ago. Up until that point, they'd been divided by race, old gang affiliation, or left to survive on their own. Dantes got a number of looks as he followed Wayne through the winding passages and past the pipes carrying fresh water throughout the cells. He was grateful that he didn't see tell. He had no desire to see the sad expression on his face that had left him with last time they'd spoken. Wayne led him into Merle's room, and they stepped inside. The walls of it were completely covered in alchemical formulae, cryptic writing in what looked like elvish script, strange diagrams, lists of ingredients, and a number of other things written too small for Dantes to recognize. Merle was laying on a bench of stone. He had a long metal rod across his chest, gripped by both of his hands. On either end of the rod was a massive square block. They stood there in silence, watching as he slowly brought the bar to his chest, then lifted it up, then repeated the motion 5 more times. When he was done, he tossed the bar down, and it hit the ground with a heavy thud. Merle sat up and fixed them with a look. Dantes had always found his appearance disconcerting. He had a long white beard and a heavily wrinkled face, both showing his advanced age, but after his neck the effects of aging seemed to have ceased. His muscles would make most orcs jealous. Wayne, who was by no means small for his race, was roughly half as wide as Merle was. Merle had started to exercise when he had first arrived in the pit to compensate for his lack of magic, and had somehow gotten even bigger even in his old age. He kept his mind and body sharp, and it was the threat of violence that he, and those collared that had adopted his training as their own, posed that gave the collared what little power they had. He grabbed a pair of delicate glasses and placed them onto his face, squinting. He smiled the kind of smile only a wizened old wizard could. "Well, Wayne, I see you've learned a bit of necromancy. Been a while since I've seen a dead man walking." Merle chuckled at his own joke, then grabbed a rag and began wiping the sweat from his oddly muscular frame. He stretched his neck left, then right, eliciting audible cracks each time that made Wayne flinch. He stood and approached them. "Let's not waste any time. One of my people is almost certainly on their way to sell you out and tell the kings that you're here, ripe for the murdering." He lifted the top part of his robe back up and over his torso, leaving the majority of his chest exposed. "So what do you want? You're a smart guy, so I'm guessing it's not protection, since you know I can't offer that. Unless you found some secret cache of magical items, or you have some secret method to remove one of our collars. That would be about the only thing worth fighting the kings." "No such luck," said Dantes. "I just want a favor, since I've always been friendly to you and yours." "Friendly? Swindling my people at dice, sending them to that kobold brewer to burn out their stomach lining, and occasionally beating them for taking too long to pay back a loan?" He laughed. "I suppose that's as close to friendship as things get down here. Don't beat around the bush. Just tell me what you want, and we'll go from there. I want to surrender to the kings. I want you to tell them I'll turn myself into them willingly in return for a quick death." Merle's expression turned from affable to disappointed. "Really? For what I'd been told about you? I thought you'd have more fight in you than that." Dantes shook his head. "Nope. And this isn't some elaborate plot or ruse. No, I'm just tired of hiding." Merle looked at him for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he looked down, letting out a long exhale of breath. "Fine. I'll tell them what you're offering. Come back in a day, and we'll give you their answer. I'd like them to do it in the undermarket as well. Let the consortium drum up a bit of extra business out of a public execution. Maybe line your pockets for the privilege." Merlin's face twinged a bit as he fought down a smile. "Well, at least you're as dramatic as ID heard fine. They'll let them know all of your conditions. It'll talk to the consortium as well. Come back here in a day, and he'll have their answers." Dantes opened his mouth, but Merle held out his hand to stop him. "Don't worry about us selling you out. We can't stand against the kings in a straight-up war, but all that you've asked is within our abilities and without much risk." Dantes just nodded. Merle looked at them both and pointed at the exit to his room. "All right, leave. I have squats to do." Dantes and Wayne left the chamber. The last thing they heard from the room was a grunt and grinding of stone as Merle began hefting his massive weights. Wayne hesitated outside of Merle's door. "Did you want to talk to Tell? I mean, if you're going to die and all, maybe play some dice?" Dantes sighed. "I would, but I'd be surprised if Pillion or someone like him didn't give the elves the heads up that I'm here. If I stay, they'll have the opportunity to kill me before they even hear the proposal, and I'd really prefer to be beheaded or stabbed quickly in the heart compared to whatever else they may do to me." Wayne nodded and finished escorting him to the edge of the Collard's cavern. "You have anything you might want to leave to an old gambling buddy? Since you're going to die anyway." Dantes smiled. "Don't worry. They'll let you know where my old digs are tomorrow if they take me up on my offer. You and Tell can rate it at your leisure. I just want a chance to enjoy it myself on what may be my last night here. If you find this story on Amazon, Be aware that it has been stolen. Please report the infringement. Wayne nodded. Fair enough. See you tomorrow, then? He spoke the question as if unsure of what tone to take, and landed somewhere between dour and awkward. Yep, Dantes said, as he slipped into the dark of the cave. He felt strongly that the kings would take him up on his offer. The fact that Head managed to avoid them so far was likely embarrassing to them. A chance for them to show their dominance over other races would let them reclaim their dignity and remind everyone that they were not to be fucked with. Just in case, though, he shifted his attention back to the rats Head sent to their territory in the undermarket, pausing in a dank, dark corner so that he could place his focus thoroughly on them. The rats in their territory he had sent to search for the mirror shards he hadn't stolen, and one of them had already located one of them. Those in the undermarket watched the elves there, and over the course of an hour he used them to confirm which of the elves were leaders and which were followers. It didn't take much, as his own knowledge of their gang wasn't insignificant. He just wanted to have absolute confirmation. Once he was done, he broke his connection with the rats and let them go back about their business. Checking the rat mark, he noted that one tooth was still half full. He made it back to his cave without much fuss, and Jacopo crawled out of his jacket to return to his usual corner. Dantes gave him the piece of meat he owed him, as well as a bit of extra, just because. He then gathered up the mirror fragments and laid all of them out in a straight line. He had 11 left. It should be enough. He was tempted to tuck a few away to save them for later, but he didn't want to risk not bringing enough firepower. He had a small meal, then left to check again on his garden. The red leaves of the plants all looked lush and healthy, and somehow even more fruit had started to grow even after the recent harvest had allowed the rats. The plants were calling out softly for more blood. They didn't need it, he could tell, but they wanted it. This time he obliged them. He generously granted each plant not just one, but 3 drops of blood. Their leaves and branches visibly shuddered as the blood reached their roots. Once that was done, he went back to his cave. He dug out an old pipe and smoked a bit of the weed Head bought from Clay in the undermarket before everything had gone to shit. He took 2 long inhales, letting out small clouds of smoke as he did so. He considered doing that small amount of dust Head stolen as well, but decided that his only intent was to ease his nerves, not remove them entirely. Besides which, he didn't want to fall back into that habit. Snorting it now would be admitting he didn't expect to live past the next day at a novel been at. He smoked a bit more, ate a bit more, then allowed himself to drift off to sleep. He awoke the next day, feeling more rested than he had in days. For once Head had a dreamless sleep rather than a dream of gods or familiar nightmares of weightlessness as he fell. He stretched, ate, packed his pipe for one more smoke, then watered all of his plants and fed his fungus. After that, he went back to his garden. He blinked as he entered the chamber that contained it, rubbing his eyes and wondering for a moment if Head slept far longer than Head meant to, or perhaps if the weed Head smoked had been stronger than Head anticipated. All of the plants in the garden had grown exponentially. The grapevines covered the ground. The peach tree had a trunk as thick as his torso and rose to twice his height. Fruit, ripe and massive, had grown from every tree, all of it the same shade of blood red as their leaves were. Dantes went to one of the smaller trees and plucked an apple from it. He took a bite. It was sweet and firm, far different from the crab apples he was used to, and unlike anything Head tasted before. He continued eating the apple as he walked the length of the garden, handing its core to Jacopo as he finished it, and wiping a bit of excess juice from his chin with the sleeve of his jacket. He reached out with his life sense to all the rats he could possibly detect. Come! The rats swarmed forward, out of every nook and cranny, 1, maybe even 200 of them. Once they'd all arrived, they turned their attention to Dantes and waited. I have a request for all of you, but before we get to that, he gestured to the plants all around the garden. Eat. There was no hesitation after he spoke that word. The rats all ran up the trees, into the bushes, and through the vines. They plucked up grapes and tore into them, or bit peaches from trees, falling down with them before fighting other rats to keep from having to share. They even chewed their way through apples still on branches, leaving only the stem behind as they gnawed through everything they could. As they ate, Dantes watched one tooth on his rat mark fill completely. Then the second one began trickling up as well. He smiled as he watched the rats and all the chaos they were creating in front of him. Once they were done, and every piece of fruit on the trees had been completely consumed, he pointed at the peach tree. "That one is Jacopo's," he said, gesturing to Jacopo, who had taken his place on his shoulder. "He decides whether or not to share it. The rest of the fruit here, you're only welcome to after it has ripened beyond edibility for me. But after that, it's fair game." The rats listened intently, letting out small squeaks of agreement or wiggling their whiskers. Now on to my request. Once all Dante's preparation was done, he returned to the collard to find not just Wayne, but Tell waiting for him by their entrance. He felt the rats that were trailing him slip through cracks in the walls, or scurry through dark corners as the majority of them made their way to the undermarket. Roughly 24 stayed near him, including a couple head-tied mirror shards too. He trusted Merle to do his best to keep things civil, and he already knew that the Kings had accepted the deal thanks to a bit of spying Jacopo had done before it had arrived, but tensions were high, and it never hurt to have a backup plan. Tell looked a bit dejected and hesitated to say anything, so Wayne spoke up first. "Merle told me to tell you that the elves took you up on your offer. They're waiting at the undermarket for you to show up. You have until the end of the day today, or else they'll hunt you. They promised that if you did that, they'd flay you alive with dull knives." "Lovely." Tell stepped forward. "You're sure about giving up? It doesn't seem like you to just let them cut off your head like this." "I'm sure. I want to go out quick and clean. Not hunted down and beaten to death. Not starving in my little cave, scared and waiting for them to find me. I want on my terms. Besides, this way I can do the collard a solid on my way out." "Speaking of doing a solid," said Wayne not so subtly, "you're shameless, you know that? It's one of my better qualities. Get it from my mother, I think. I left a map to my cave in a hidey hole. Tell knows where it is." He looked to him. "Remember where I hid that mirror shard? That's where it is. Wanted you to have first dibs on what I'm leaving behind. Smoked most of my weed, though, so you won't find much of that." Wayne chuckled. "We smelled as much before you even rounded the corner." Dantes shrugged. "There are worse ways to spend a final day." Tell grimaced again. "I could smuggle you food, you know? We could work things out that you could lay low for years. The Kings could lose interest eventually." Dantes shook his head. "I already live half a life here in the pit. I won't live an eighth of one." Wayne nodded sagely. "There's wisdom in that." Tell just threw up his hands. "All right, I tried. Fuck, at it novel been at. Dantes considered for a moment telling him his plan when he saw the distress he was causing him. That moment ended quickly, though. He liked Tell. That didn't mean he trusted him. "All right then, guess I'm off to the headman." Wayne nodded. "Merle told me to bring along a few of our boys, to make sure they give the clean death you were promised. Wouldn't do what little rep we have any good if we don't follow through." Dantes shrugged. "You can be honest and just say they want to see the spectacle of having me killed." Wayne chuckled. "Well, Pillion did volunteer, but the rest of them don't really know you. They're Merle's more ardent disciples." Wayne's inhaled through his nostrils deeply. "Ah, that's him now." Dantes looked and saw 4 men nearly as massive as Merle himself. Collars digging into their thick necks, old mage robes barely clinging to them despite their looseness, and arms as big as their heads. Behind those 4 impressive specimens was Pillion with a smirk on his face. Dantes frowned. Those 5 meant there would be more damage to mitigate, but he couldn't blame Merle for it, nor was it entirely unexpected. He nodded at the man. "Ready to watch me die? This narrative has been purloined without the author's approval. Report any appearances on Amazon." Pillion chuckled. "Very. Don't worry. We'll try to make sure I bleed on you a bit. May tell one of the elves that the crime that got you here was raping an elven virgin before they off me." Pillion's face went red. "And just here for theft. I know. Hopefully they'll believe you when you tell them that. Though I do wonder if they question a dying man's last words too much. Fucking asshole. I'm looking forward to seeing your head tumble across the market," muttered Pillion, slinking behind the 4 much larger escorts. "All right, we should get going." Dantes ordered the nearby rats to move along with them, and looked briefly through Jacopo's eyes. He was on a shaky roof in the undermarket. The streets were more filled than usual. He could see the usual hucksters and storefronts, and the witch wench was doing excellent business with the increased foot traffic. Most importantly, he could see that a small stage of sorts had been erected, with a delicate steel blade driven into its center. Elves surrounded the crude stage, mostly the ones he recognized to be from the gang's leadership. Their duke, Ruthless, was sitting on the stage edge, sneering at a nearby halfling and hollering a slur in his direction. Along with the elves was a heavier press of other races as well. Several orcs from their gang, which had the sense not to name themselves, a half-dozen members of Clan Stonedust, including Iron, and a few members of Consortium, taking bets on what the result would be. Not whether or not Dantes would die, but whether he would chicken out, or if the elves would purposefully make it slow after saying they wouldn't, little things like that. He could also sense the other rats through Jacopo, taking their places with the mirror shards, preparing. Dantes had a few more moving even further than the undermarket, but had found that it spent favor more quickly to look through those rats whose eyes were further away, particularly those other than Jacopo, whose eyes he could peer through at no cost at all. "Did you hear me, Dantes?" asked Tell. Dantes shook his head. Looking through Jacopo's eyes and using his newfound abilities was still distracting. He'd need to work on doing it more naturally, assuming his plan worked and he survived. "No, not at all. Just wondering if they'll behead me, or what other options they may have chosen. Probably a rapier through the heart," said one of the escorts, a strangely muscular elf. The traditionalists usually favor that way. Too vain for beheadings? That and back in the Fey realm, it wasn't as much of a guarantee of death. There's an old story of a Green Knight. It was a whole thing. Rapier through the heart isn't too bad. Appreciate the information. It also impacted a few last-minute decisions he needed to make. What I was saying is that'll be going too. Dantes frowned. "Why? So may need a shoulder to cry on after you're gone." "I want to be the first to volunteer," he lied, poorly. "I'm pretty sure she'll have her hands full with other business." "Feel free to lie and tell her it was my last wish that Shed give you a lay for free." Tell put a hand on Dante's arm, managing a brief smile. "You're a true friend." He nodded, though he knew a true friend would do everything he could to keep him from walking into the chaos he was about to cause. With nothing left to say, the group began the walk to the undermarket. Unlike the roundabout paths and strange caverns Dantes usually wound his way through, the group went straight to the undermarket. It made him nervous, even more so than his unfolding plot. The group made it to the market in roughly half the time it usually took him to do so, and the dwarven guards waved them through with no issue. Just as had seen through Jacopo's eyes, there was a large crowd gathered. Members of all the major gangs were milling about, as were randoms, gamblers, and the usual degenerates that made up the thriving Underprison community. He took a moment to disperse the rats that were still with him and had them take their positions. He checked on the other rats that had sent ahead and found that they were already in place, or at least near enough that it didn't matter. They were good at following orders, especially when Jacopo assisted him in ensuring that they understood them. He quickly checked the rat mark on his arm. It still had a full thong of gold left. The crowd parted when they noticed Dantes and the collard that were with him. At the far edge of the crowd, he saw the elves gathered and waiting, smirks on their faces as they looked down their noses at him. Ruthless, still shirtless as he had been every time Dantes had seen him, leapt down from the crudely erected stage. His tattoos shifted and moved as they played across his lean musculature, making it look as if the tree on his chest was swaying in the wind. He gestured to the crowd and looked directly at Dantes. "Let this be an example to all of you. To cross me, to cross your betters, is a fool's game." This mutt realized that, and chose the only smart move he could, choosing not to play. Dantes clenched his jaw, feeling his small tusks poke against the inside of his cheeks. He hadn't even begun to play.